Um, Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming back after the break. Uh, this is a bit of a momentous occasion for me in the sense that, like, this is the first time I'm presenting from this podium after 10 years. The last time I was here was for my DRL public jury, presenting as a student. In the interim, I worked in Zadi, the architects, leading their computation and design group, and also worked in various capacities within the DRL, including initially supporting Patrik Studio and Theo Studio. And I've also tried to, in the recent past, extend my research interests at the ETH Zurich. So I would like to begin by thanking Patrik and Brett for the last 10 years, and also specifically for the opportunity to speak here. So I'm going to speak about my contribution to the magazine called titled Upgrading Computational Design. So looking back at let's say Willemard's vision of what architecture could be in the year 2000, on these postcards that he made in 1910, we could kind of safely assume a lot of the technological promises have been delivered. Computers have definitely evolved past their mechanical origins to being from room size to your phones, and computer-controlled machines have definitely evolved past their baby steps and are in full stride, as we saw Theo's presentation and also Rob's presentation. So this video is not working, but so specifically with regard to Parametricism 2.0, as Patrik mentioned, it's trying to regain some of the momentum that was lost in the postmodernist times, or specifically, as Patrik mentioned, in the crisis of 2008 and beyond. So of that, we've been focusing at Zaha Code and also our efforts at the DRL on a kind of attendant aspect of upgrading our design process, making it ready to receive, have more degrees of freedom, let's say, to tackle additional problems. Part of that endeavor, and I have to admit, this is only recently that I've started trying to situate the work, mostly based on the basis of provocation from Patrik and Theo and others, trying to look back at previous attempts to articulate the role of science in how rapidly technology is evolving. And it's not a very old phenomena; it's a 20th century phenomena that. Technology is evolving so rapidly, and a large part of that comes down to organized science. And so specifically, then one of the things that interests me in a kind of wider context is previous attempts to situate architecture itself in such a way, as a science, and also how these episodal events in the 60s and 70s, people like Lionel March, George Steiny, and also Theo mentioned Architecture Machine Group, and so what were their successes and how they failed, and one of the things that kind of sticks out very interestingly, in this article by Sean Keller, is that the first attempt to think of architecture as a science in the 20th century failed almost precisely because they wanted to negate or not consider any aesthetics. They wanted to see it as a kind of problem-solving domain in that sense. So that aspect is definitely interesting, but as I admitted previously, it's not something that I have really focused the past 10 years of work on. So in the last 10 years, we've definitely been focused on looking at looking beyond the formal opportunities afforded by contemporary design technologies, looking at their operational logics, even though they come from other disciplines like computer graphics, all the way back to their origins, and also like the automobile and shipbuilding industries, like things like subdivision surfacing and Beziers and NURBS and these kind of things, and the formal opportunities these technologies offer. We've also been interested in or collaborating with engineers in trying to understand how they're leveraging biological phenomena or understanding or biological science in and applying that to building scale or engineering of buildings. But particularly, we've also been interested how the artists and mathematicians have kind of abstracted the same biological phenomena or material-based phenomena in a kind of geometric way, and that specific geometric aspect is has been a core of my interest, and by extension, Zaha code in some sense. So we've also invested time in looking beyond the flamboyance of seminal designers and their iconic products, but also look at the actual opportunities latent in their manufacturing processes and how they organize material to get the design affects that they were so keen with. And also specifically with Ray and Charles Eames, their wide network of collaborations, they had massive contributions to use of computer-aided design, and were the pioneers, at least in the design realm, working with Mathematica and other early design software. We've also been kind of very open in terms of trying to look at the work of our contemporaries, and their contributions beyond the architectural aspects, and also how they're leveraging certain intuitive geometric methods that were had their origins in the 15th and 16th century, and how they're applying that to design very contemporary buildings, high rises and so. So SOM, obviously, as all of us know, are pioneers in high-rise structures. So it is of interest in a way that they're using very geometric and intuitive methods as opposed to what we would expect engineers to actually use. So this aspect of imbuing a certain amount of rigor into the design process, and the exploration of design is beginning to bear fruit, both within the DRL, where where design is being considered in a kind of systemic generation of knowledge. So and that aspect is something that we would like to continue in a way, or we inherited from the scientific aspects. And it's definitely bearing fruit within our work at Zadi the Architects, where project independent research activities like this, design research, is beginning to bear fruit in these kind of projects that are now on site after 8 years or so. And so these this particular project is going to be completed in the Science Museum in December this year. So I'll speak a little bit about that towards the end. So there have been these aspects of pursuing historic research and kind of rediscovering a lot of aspects from pre-modernist times, and trying to see what they can afford in a contemporary situation. So one of the main interests in that sense, as I said, was these kind of geometric methods as opposed to the numerical methods of structural calculations. And the reason we're particularly interested in this is, again, if you intuitively are able to understand structure, it affords more degrees of freedom for you to take on other things. And that's one of the kind of motivations, let's say. Even engineers, at the beginning of when concrete was first invented or like being widely adopted. Like they didn't really have any numerical methods to calculate concrete, and like they were, even engineers were resorting to these kind of graphical methods. And that's partially the interest we have in collaborating with like people like Philippe Bloch at like Bloch Research Group, who are fully extending these geometric methods of understanding structure to 3D. Like the previous methods were like only 2D, so you had to do it many times, and now they're extending this fully into 3D, and that's been a kind of major motivation or aspect of research for us in recent times. And like collaboratively, we're trying to design these things. Like, so this would be, if built or when built, completely compression only stone structure, which not only extend like previous research, but also take on like our research in manipulating form, like coming from like our experience in computer graphics and things like this. So another particular area of interest is rule surfacing. Like again, looking back into history, people like Gaudi obviously mastered this using these kind of geometries in an expressive way, and Mark Berry, who also contributed to the magazine, who's by now worked just as long on the Sagrada Familia as Gaudi himself. So, and also Candela, who's like, obviously, if anyone knows rule surfacing and hyperbolic paraboloids, it's probably Candela. And so we did a kind of project with Bollinger Grohmann engineers, trying to explore explore and express like the structural aspects of these geometries. And because there was manipulation at the level of software and exchange of software itself, as opposed to data, like we were able to go through produce this design or many iterations of this before and also manufacture it and assemble it in a very short time, like a month and a half. So, and that's again like to emphasize that like once you're able to do more, like then you're free to then tackle like other aspects of design, whatever those might be. And similarly, we've been spending quite a bit of time like understanding like curve crease folding, as I mentioned in the introduction, both from a mathematical point of view, like David Hoffman, who's an electrical engineer or known for his patents in electrical engineering, in his hobby time also developed like some seminal mathematics for curve crease folding, and Ron Resch, who influenced Chuck Hoberman in his transformable aspects or kinetic aspects of curve crease folding, have been like very important references for us. And also like how artists are manipulating sheet-like material into these expressive forms and geometries. So, and to extend that, like, you know, working with like people like Helmut Pottmann in Vienna, like who's a mathematician by training, but of recent time, like taken a keen interest in architectural geometry. So they're really transforming or providing architects with an opportunity to like, by taking on the hard work of doing the mathematics behind things, like allowing us to be able to think of other aspects like the way it behaves structurally or fabrication constraints. So we were able to, because they've already exposed all of these aspects, oops, sorry. Again, was like, we went into this project knowing nothing about origami or the curved version of origami, or how we would manufacture this or how it would actually behave structurally, and nonetheless, like within a short time of like 3 months and a small team of like three people and like a few robots with RoboFold, were able to assemble this. Again, like time, I'm just mentioning it as a way that speed is only enabled by all of these other people kind of working and freeing up or doing all the groundwork, let's say. Another a recent project, like which is yet to be built, but hopefully soon, investigates kind of rule geometry and also aspects of like constructing staircases, which have been kind of a lost art in a way. Like even in the UK, there are several examples in the past of these kind of staircases. This one is from the US. And Palladio himself, like originally, like contributed to the design of such staircases and clever structural tricks of like getting the treads to be as thin as possible by just resting them on each other and preventing them from torquing, which means like the amount of work done by the supporting wall is significantly less. So these kind of tricks, like again, of combined with like contemporary robotic technology of manufacture, then becomes like a geometric game like that we can play of like balancing one block onto another and tracking where the center of gravity moves. And so we were, I mean, this one was 3D printed and there's a tension cable going through the middle. And we hope that we can replicate this at like full scale. And kind of express that aspect, again, of not only rule geometry, but also projective techniques that were very, very prominent in the 18th century. And like there were manuals and of design and instruments to draw these kind of things pre-computer. So, and that's something that like generally motivates us to rediscover these things. And also with the Gallery for Mathematics, which, as I said, like will be opened in December of this year. It's also a tie back to the time I spent in the DRL as a student. Like my colleagues, like not my teammates, but like other teams during my time, and I think this was Brett's last team before he became director. They were exploring like minimal surfaces like in Mathematica in a kind of mathematical way. At the same time, there was another team exploring similar geometries in a manually model way, which kind of particularly combining that with our prior experience in like doing tensile structures meant that like we can not only explore rule-based generation, but also then capture all those complicated things in an intuitive way. And that's, so cultivating intuition in that sense has been a kind of motivating or a theme that's run through our work for the last several years. And also then it allows us to understand like things which we are not generally trained to understand a bit more in depth. So like these methods developed by engineers of Reotto, Scheck, and Linkwitz originally to engineer the Munich Stadium. By now it's like in almost every software, let's say. And also people in this country, in University of Bath, who contributed significantly to the design of the British Museum roof. So all of these methods like have been made accessible to designers, and like I think or digested, like all the complex mathematics have been kind of simplified enough for us to interact with it beyond like just using the tools. We can begin to understand a little bit more in depth on what opportunities there might be, like to intervene and therefore add additional constraints of like fabrication or any other. So far we've been only looking at like adding fabrication constraints, but like there's definitely scope to add other constraints, let's say. And so obviously, and these kind of structures are quite popular within London, and the fact that these engineers and mathematicians have made these kind of tools available, like I think, contributes significantly to why they're so popular in recent times. Like almost every architecture school, for sure, I've seen a project that tries to use these kind of form-finding techniques, and both for structural reasons, but also kind of manipulate them to do other things. So in our case, like, it also allows us to understand, like, interface with extend design all the way until engineering of the final piece, and we have an input even at this late stage where they're prototyping this, and we can then say, like, move the seam lines because your seam lines are different from what we are getting, and like, so we can kind of really collaborate with engineers, like in a much more iterative way, as opposed to a few years ago where it might have been only a linear way that our architects design something and they engineer it, and someone else builds it. So it's a kind of return to a slightly 19th century mode of practice, let's say, where there is more conversation all the way until things are fully fabricated on site. So in summation, like, so this is what I tried to capture in the art, in my contribution to the article, that design research or upgrading of design research for us in the last 10 years has meant, like, to skill up and to tool up, and both in inheriting a kind of systemic way of generating knowledge, and also reconnecting with past methods, and kind of establishing a continuum, like, which was clearly broken, like in the 80s, and so, and also trying to work in a interdisciplinary way and not just copy images or take and abuse, like, algorithms, but like really try and understand, like, how we can have a conversation with other disciplines throughout the design process, both at the early stages and all the way up to, like, final execution on site. And of course, like, a few examples I try to show, try to articulate also the link between academia and profession. That's also, in my opinion, a very important conversation, that there is constant feedback between these two aspects of the discipline. Yeah. So in that sense, trying to argue for, there have been, like, these kind of episodal events in the past, like whether be it Bauhaus or, as I mentioned, like the center in Cambridge started by the likes of Lionel March, and similar efforts by Christopher Alexander in the US, and Theo mentioned the Architecture Machine Group, and so, like, to really allow for and nurture these kind of endeavors, so that it's beyond episodes, that it, like, that we can give architectural research the kind of long sustained periods of innovation that it so richly deserves and is needed. So I'll just finish with this video, but thank you. Yeah, if you have questions.
I have a question. Is there a mic? Is there a microphone? Okay. So, 1, 2, 3. Hello? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, I didn't want you to step off the platform without facing up to this one. It's basically the same question I leveled at Rob. And I just rehearse some of the things you said and expose again what I would call a kind of muteness and vacuum at the very core of your project as architect. So you said just now we're seeking these conversations with other disciplines, and they seem to be very eloquent with respect to the intelligence, articulate intelligence of the discipline. You become conversant with them to a point. When you also have to admit that you're not quite fully conversant. But then again, why don't you leave it to them? And my question thrown at you is, how about the core competency of your own discipline? Are you just an amateurish follower of the engineers? Now I have a next question, where there may be some hints towards a solution. You talked about the use of form-finding techniques for structural reasons. Then it was a little more timid, and also to manipulate them for other things. What are these other things? These other things are the core competency, I suspect, but you're mute. Then you're throwing in, talk about, you hint at formal opportunities of the, let's say, form-finding methodologies or computational methodologies. And you talk about design effects. But these are a single, let's say, one-liner phrases which always remain unelaborated. So it's vacuous.
Yes. As I mentioned, it's kind of in a way as attempt to really see where the opportunities, as I tried to mention, that like what are the degrees of freedom. First, if we establish that, like, and then we know where to poke and where we can add the architectural bits.
But you don't know the architectural bits.
Yes.
I mean, you're digging your hole ever deeper. Listen, it's unfair. I know you don't have the answer. But you all know by now, my claim, the answers are in my writings. So why is it so hard to get them out, even for people who are them closest with? That's why I said these writings sitting there like a dead letter. And I have to pick you out one by one, crack up your skulls, and have a communication. But you don't have to come at one. Anybody else with a question?
Okay, Eduardo, good luck.
Anybody else? Maybe it's unfair, but I have to step up, ratchet up a little bit, because 5 years of muteness is too much. In terms of my writing, response to my writings. Okay, Rico. Eduardo, I mean. Sorry. Super sophisticated what you're doing, by the way. Don't get this wrong.
No pressure. A ver. ¿Das las gracias tú o yo? Sí, okay. Vale.
Okay. Hello. Well, first of all, we would like to thank both Patrik and Brett for giving us this opportunity to participate in this symposium. We are Eduardo Rico, I am Enriqueta Llabres, and we are going to present today the development of a conceptual framework, mainly based on the development of these three terms: parameters, values, and tacit forms of algorithms, and how we will go through some examples of our work in relational urbanism and how these terms have influenced the development of our work. So I want to open the discussion with this image. This image was captured by the latest satellite that was launched by the ESA. So it uses a land surface temperature radiometer to show the brightness temperature of the land in Namibia. Then this image is processed, and you can get the temperature of the surface. This information is very important to understand the health of certain ecosystems that are in the coast, basically fisheries and coastline ecosystem. So it also reflects that it's clear that digital technologies have brought new lenses through which I look at the urban environment. But perhaps, and that's what we argue, if the current scenario is distinctive, it's because these technologies are empowering people. They are empowering people to organize themselves and claim for a more proactive role in the decisions that are taken in the closed environment. This case is the Blue Carbon Portal. It's an online community that disseminates scientific research, policy instruments, and market applications for the conservation of the blue carbon, which is the capacity of coastal ecosystems to perform as carbon sinks. Let me see if I can play the video. Oh, okay. Yeah, so basically in here you have a tool for information sharing and a social media platform, but also it is a tool that people can use and produce their own data about the coastal ecosystem. So another example is the Smart Citizen Beta in Barcelona, where individuals are provided with the opportunity to get an open source toolkit in order to measure themselves the quality of the air in their closed environment. Then this is put together in a map, and the idea is to try to bring together people and bring awareness of the quality of the air. So these new digital forms of urban documentation might generate awareness or act as environmental check, but from our perspective are pointing to a question in digital design, is how parameters or data can start to build shared values. So parameters are bounded to define the particular system from which a quantity is selected, according to specific circumstances and in relation to which other variables might be expressed. Values point to the fact that something is held to deserve its importance of or worth of something for someone.
From these definitions, we can see that both parameters and values are relative. Parameters are relative to a system. They are linked to explicit forms of knowledge. They were born to rationalize, to turn things and processes into intelligible and measurable entities. And one of the examples, the most common and famous examples at the urban level, was the way in which cholera was tackled in 1854 by John Snow. He actually went through the process of mapping the location of the incidences and the number of them into sort of little charts and little bar charts around Soho. And what then he actually did is he turned and he started to measure the walking distance from one of the wells. He thought that the wells were the source of the problem. And he fabricated that initial cell around that drawing there of the cell that actually related to what he already knew was a Voronoi cell system created earlier by Descartes. And he realized that the cell was containing the epidemics. So it was quite easy to stop the epidemics. They just closed the well down, I think it's in Broad Street, and the epidemics was stopped. And not only that, but he actually brought up the emergent discipline of epidemiology. That was possible because he managed to make relations, to make value, or to make the parameters explicit. However, while that was a way of working with parameters, at the urban level, working with values is actually quite different. Values are linked to individuals. Values, in many cases, are built in a bottom-up way, in what David Harvey calls a relational way of fabricating space, time, and value, which is brought up by the intersection, the productive conflict of different domains as they meet and discuss. One of the clearest examples, again, in London, is the street network we have in the center of London that was built up of sort of lengthy negotiations and discussions that even remained so after, against all the odds, after the fire in 1666. That's the white area, that's what it was wiped out in the fire. Days after the fire took place, a number of proposals by Wren and Evelyn, sort of like Baroque type, top-down proposals poured in. But the thing is, they actually never got built because there was the mechanisms for discussion. They didn't have the tools to discuss the sort of like negotiations and compensations schemes. The owners of the lands weren't there because they were actually living somewhere else because they didn't have a house. So actually, the values of a certain, I would say, mistrust in a certain centralized power epitomized by those proposals, a certain individuality, those values prevailed, and Londoners stuck to their sort of like street pattern. There were only some minor modifications, such as street widths and open waterfront that was open until Margaret Thatcher arrived, actually. Another of the issues of values is the fact that they are linked to a form of knowledge we can call tacit. Michael Polanyi described tacit knowledge when he was saying we can know more than we can tell. Basically, tacit knowledge is that knowledge that can be conceptualized, transmitted, worked with, before we can make it explicit, before we can code it. It's a knowledge linked to intuition, inner feelings, designs. In many situations, it's a knowledge that remains tacit forever, and sometimes it turns into explicit knowledge. This is one of the examples I like and describes better how tacit knowledge works. An experiment with some students working with a river flow and a river flow experiment, where they were actually trying to rationalize and design with the flows, and part of the results were actually made explicit and categorized, but actually quite a lot was left there, just because it was so difficult to catch up with a process that was constantly moving in front of them. And I would argue that urban knowledge and designing at the urban environment has quite a lot to do with this. It's actually a knowledge that doesn't exist before you arrive there. Nobody really does know anything about it. It happens through the doing and through the interaction with stuff. Part of it is explicit, like the traffic engineer knows how much traffic you can put in a road, but part of it is tacit. At some point in time, somebody has a hunch and says, hang on a second, that's just too much without actually knowing why. So the question for a designer is how can you extract that knowledge in that messy process for your design intentions, whichever ones they are? How can you actually bring that knowledge that is somewhat tacit and explicit into the design arena? And that's one of the things that we have been working in. How do you balance that idea, that relationship between parameters, values, and tacit forms of algorithms with what we call relational urban models, these sort of toolkits of design and analytic models that allow people to interact with the design and understand the implications on another domain to actually start building up the conversations. What we're going to show now is a number of projects that have a different components of parameter, value, and tacitness.
So the first project I'm going to show is a relational urban model we built for Baishisho. In this case, the two main actors was the master developer and the urban municipality, one claiming more value for money, the other claiming for a more social mix, and you will see that it was basically constituted into a system in which the parameters domain had a domain. So Baishisho is an urban village. It is at the center of Shenzhen. It's quite emblematic, and they are going to knock it down, and we were approached by Shenzhen University to try to think about an alternative. They are called kissing buildings. They are quite diverse. Some are quite unhealthy, but some are quite okay, I will say. But more important is that they can host key workers in the city, people who could not afford to live somewhere else. So the question was, in this particular relational urban model, whether we could remove parts of the urban village that didn't work and give another opportunity to the existing urban fabric, providing a much better social mix for the city. So we scripted the problem. We basically built a relational urban model in which we coded economic parameters, we coded regulatory parameters, and we also built a parameter on our own called the shadow area ratio in order to evaluate morphology and how much shadow it will cast. So we started to study orientations, and we came up with a particular orientation that would perform better. So in order to get this relational model working through, we wanted to have a generative network in which you could select any part of the urban village you want to retain, and the generative network will be a response. And basically, the blocks that are more close to the urban village, they try to wrap, they try to create a symbiosis with existing fabric, whereas the other take more the angle of more effectiveness for the sunlight. We also put into our faces what does it mean to go from FAR of 2 to FAR of 7, this dramatic shift in the urban fabric. And we realized that if we wanted to work together with the urban villages, we wanted to also get something from the grain that this existing urban fabric had. So we scripted a series of plinths that will work together with the urban village, trying to create these interstitial spaces, but that these plinths will respond to economic model in the sense that you will always try to build that as much as area as the developer will need in order to meet its own ambition as well. The sunlight regulations, instead of having the blocks organized in relation to the sun, the residential blocks will emerge from this podium, and then the sunlight will sculpt the end morphology. So,
the model was working with an optimization engine that we called a floating model. It would allow to, most importantly, interrupt the parametric flow, the typical parametric flow information. So you could actually work on a typical way in which you would say, I want this development, I want to know now, how much am I impacting traffic and infrastructure, but you could revert it on the fly and says, well, actually, I want to know what development I can afford such that the impact on blah, 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 it doesn't go more than blah, blah, blah. So you could actually really change input into output and output into input to understand the impacts of one element into other domains. That was the overall flowchart of the sort of pseudocode of the entire project. This is the way that the prototypes were working. On the left was one of the first prototypes. I cannot move it forward. Give me a second. And on the right, we have a more sort of newer version that we have already generated, which is more based on GIS. So in a way, you can actually upload the data in GIS, link it to the website, and have the Excel and the sort of database playing in the background. I don't know if I can pass the image forward, fast forward. I think I can't. Well, we have to imagine it. So in a way, this would allow you to click on the blocks, bring them up, down, change the different parameters, and have a playful exercise before you actually freeze the options. The result was simple, clear, controlled massing that was actually maximizing the parameter that the landowner wanted to talk about in terms of value and return. It would allow a certain level of flow, connectivity to the existing fabric, granularity, diversity in the fabric, and in a way, a fabric that wasn't trying to overwhelm the existing one, like moving the towers away from it, and having a sort of a cascading of scales and sizes between the existing and the new. And that was in a way preserved with the discussion on values, infrastructure in the front as part of the interface. Another case we worked was in Santos, that's Brazil. Different totally environment. This is another project we did, another relational urban model with Arup. The previous one was as well with Arup. In this case, it was low density, fractured ownership, an industrial area at the outskirts of, near the center of Santos, but towards the industrial port, an area where basically the plots to be selected were not known. There wasn't a master plan. It was about how do you find strategies to create coherence within a situation where there's not such thing as one owner. So the idea is that the entire outcome would depend on the shared values of individuals as opposed to one single outcome. It came more as a work of finding incentives, testing incentives, so you could actually select any number of plots. The computer would thread a landscape strategy, and you could actually play with incentives so that you would give more area to those which are more generous with the open space, and then they could actually trade land use between them. But at the end of the day, it was about figuring out how to obtain coherence from the bottom up by sharing the value of the different landowners. Moving more towards a more tacit form of engagement, more playful. This is an installation we did in Wuhan in the Future City workshop. Wuhan is a city in the Yangtze River where there was an increasing awareness of the impact they are having on that river. So we wanted to do an installation where people could have an idea or could actually get a sense of the implications of doing particular actions on the river. So the idea was to build up a physical model of a river 2 by 1 that was live, there, moving. The river was moving in front of your eyes in an interval of 5 minutes. You could actually dig holes and ponds in the river, and it was digitally captured. And an entire ecological analysis was built upon the sort of assumption that that was a real scale river. So actually it was more of a playful scenario where the people were actually creating ponds, rubbing them, and the sort of like, there was a certain guarantee that the river would behave as a braided system because of similarity principles. And those are the digital captures of the river, and that's in a way the way it was working with the river, the sediments coming from the top, filling in the little sort of like lakes happening in the middle, and then the digital capture happening live. So in a way, you could actually see what were the implications of the bits that you were doing in a very kind of like playful way, because the time of response was reasonably linked to the, to a person in an exhibition. So in terms of playfulness, we now move to the last project.
Yes. I think this is the last project we won, in which we explore further our repertoire related to the development of tacit forms of algorithm. This is Lefanu Park in Ireland, and the brief of the project was to bring innovative ways of engaging the community in the project. So one of the main users was BMX riders and skaters, and in order for us to be proactive in the design, we need to capture how skaters experience a space and how they want to move across a space. So we developed a toolkit with a sandbox and a series of elements to capture that. The material, so basically it was a simple toolkit, and the whole idea of this toolkit was to allow people to enter in our ethos and to explore within our own repertoire of design and space. So something that we are really interested from the parametric models is the capacity, the openness that they have, and the capacity that we can have to capture willingness and to let people to enter within our domain and experience our domain, which in our experience, it brought lots of happiness from people. It was incredible. They felt really, really well. So, so this is a summary of the toolkit. There on the side, we play with the skaters, different ages, with kids, and as I said, now we are going into construction stages, and they only tell us we want more of these things, we want more parametric tools, we want to join you in this journey. So it's, I think, an innovative way of doing placemaking, all this stuff that architects, we don't want to deal with for obvious reasons. So we also perform other ways of gathering data in order to understand what Eduardo explained before, the relational construction of a space, time, and value is which in very clear terms how different groups value the space. So we can start to build the agenda of the project. And we came about that there was a conflict between two groups. So basically, the groups that live in the front of the Lefanu Road, they didn't want the park to be turned into concrete. So we came about with this cut and fill strategy in which the material extracted from the balls generated a series of landforms in the park. So I think in here the design also reflects this conflict through a relational construction of a space, time, and value, where flows only flow in one direction, but there is a clear spatial division and confrontation coming from these two domains. So the fact that we use parametric model, it allows a form of participation and engagement with the community, but this form of participation was in the form of parametric model, allowing for entering in augmented reality, entering our design ethos, and play within the boundaries of our design repertoire. So that means that there was a lot of tacit knowledge that was communicated through inner feelings and communication about the aesthetics of the space. So we realized that actually when we brought the aesthetics, when we brought our design agenda into the consultation, the enthusiasm just really climbed up. It was before they were like another boring story, but really it was about creating the values of a space. So yeah, another image that is clear how this the methodology also starts to affect the way space and design is deployed. So we think that when we introduce parameters, values, and tacit forms of algorithm, you not only have this space of flows, but you have confrontation, you have encounter, you have unpredicted things. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks. It's a question for everybody. We heard now you work with a lot of ecological parameters and put them in. In the talk before, we had engineering parameters and techniques. And my question is, for me, the core competency of architecture is organizing, articulation, and signification of space to enable and enhance the social life and social life processes. That was, for me, always the core. And now the question is, do we widen this core? Is it going bigger? Do we let ecologists in or engineers? Do we absorb them? Or is there still a clear cut between the professions? That's my question to everybody. Thanks.
I would like to maybe make a comment with regards to the environmental issue or the, I mean, it's clear that there is an issue there, but in the 1960s already Harding said that the environment is not a technical problem, it's an humanities problem. So, and he brought the example of the atomic bomb. So there is no technical solution for that. You know, you need to agree. You need to come up together and agree on the solution, and this solution comes from what we argue, and we have a clear position about it, a relational construction of a space, time, and value. So, for example, in the Lefanu Park, one option could be to just hide this conflict. But there is this conflict, and actually, instead of choosing one, you can look for the intersection of the conflict and let it unveil. And the design, because design at the end makes significance, creates meaning to everything that we have, also provides meaning to this conflict, and this conflict becomes something positive, and actually became something incredibly positive. So this is not, this is in a real world, and in a very complicated place, and it worked.
And I think you've made a quite a nice definition of what design should be, architecture should be. And I think the answer to the question is, should we do this or that? I think the answer is yes to both. And one of the things that we realized when we went to the consultation is that we told them, look guys, you know how to skate, I know how to do this stuff. And they said, okay, fantastic. That's when they really bought into it and they made the design better. But still, we knew very clearly what we were doing well. And they knew it, and they really got a kick out of saying, hang on a second, I'm just bringing something into this. But it was clear, it was not certain, I mean, they weren't sort of feeling, oh, we are architects or whatever. But they actually, I mean, the two things happened because in a way we knew what we liked and we made sure we tailored the tool for them to give the best input they could. Oh, that was part of the...
Can I have the mic?
Sorry. Does this work?
Somebody else?
I have to, so it's okay.
Somebody else?
I get nervous, I think it's one of mine, so I want to know.
Sorry. Going back to your project that you showed in China, you built a very sophisticated parametric model, and then you talked about the sunlight and so on. Did you also go into parameters of social solidarities, this one, social structure, about potential scenarios that might unfold among the inhabitants?
Well, we went there and we worked with local NGOs to try to understand. So, I mean, there was limitations on this project. This project was a research project. It was funded by ARUB, St. James University, and it was supported by local NGOs. What we did was to capture the data from local NGOs, which I think there is always a cultural gap there. It's not the same when you can really engage with people. But they were really keen in showing that actually you do not need to demolish all the urban villages. Some are really problematic. Some, they are really not lively. You know, they are very unhealthy. But some, they are quite good. The problem is the speculation. So in that sense, in this graph, what it shows is the balance of the population mix, and we also try to defend that in terms of the functional city, because at the end of the day, the city works when different social stratum can come together to work. So if you put all the low-key workers at the fringe of the city, you are going to have a systemic problem at the larger scale. So we enter into these discussions, but of course there was not that much in depth as you will have in the left hand, where you were really could talk to the people. There was some limitations there.
So you've got a model, a very sophisticated one, which is couched in many parameters. So the parameter space that you've got to search through is huge, right? Many, many possible cities here. That's correct?
Yes, it has lots of them, yeah. It has lots. Yeah.
So I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit more about how you do that searching for an optimal parameter, solution. I mean, one possibility would be to use something like a genetic algorithm and have an explicit function, optimization function. But I wasn't hearing that. Yeah. So I want to know if you just sort of fiddled with the parameters until you found something you liked.
We didn't,
is that right?
We didn't find, or we weren't trying to find an optimal solution. I think we believe that those solutions simply don't exist. The solution doesn't exist. It's a matter of negotiation. We did have an optimization tool such that the thing is that the video wasn't working. Let me see if we can actually go further on. So for each option that you would want to draw, say for each scenario of demolition of urban fabric, the computer would try to fit in 2.5 million square meters of development, trying to make the most money for the developer. But each of those options were something to be discussed between the developer, traffic officials, and those who actually own the land there. So it wasn't a matter of saying, we found the optimal solution. An optimization engine was actually, once you have sort of set the basis of the discussion, say, I want to retain that area on the top, it will actually optimize the rest for you to make the most money. But the point was making lots of iterations and lots of discussions. Can I have this traffic? Can I have this thing? Can I have? So at the end of the day, you arrive to somewhere that is not optimal, is whatever it is, through discussion. An optimization engine, yes, it helps, because what it does, it floats a development. Well, there's a number of benefits and technical benefits in having an optimization engine, because it allows to break the parametric rule and actually have it going backwards and forwards. So it's actually having all those conversations, such as, can I fit 2.5 million square meters of development? It gives you this traffic. Hang on a second. If I double the amount of traffic, what do I get? How much money do you give me in compensation? Like, those conversations only happen if you're in front of something that is telling you, okay, if I do this, I screw this junction there. And that's the point. It's never optimal, and actually it would never get built like this. But if you open up, if you help the wise guys to have that conversation, that's so much more that a master planner can actually do, no matter how many options and how many assessments you do, really. And that was kind of like the idea, as opposed to thinking that there is such an optimal point exists.
The simple structure of the model was that you had always like parameter scopes and parameters constraints, and they were playing among the two. Among these parameters were like engineering and economic models, and then there was like the generative morphology, which follow the generative network, but also the rules. So like, even if the model would want to put this amount of square meters, there is a moment in which there was no space for that, and then they said, no, you cannot put more. So there were many things. I think it was like one morphological and two constraints and scope in the model, as simple terms.
Yeah. So this is the point where you can, let's see if it works. Yeah, you can actually play with the parameters, trade one versus the other. So only God knows if they will agree or not. They may actually not want to agree this, but that's the point where the tool was made for people to discuss, as opposed to give them that. This is the one that works.
No, it's not. Oh, yeah, now it's going.
Now for the bad news.
No, I mean, first of all, congratulations for super sophisticated work, and I'm so happy that you actually capturing projects and convince clients and win competitions with this, and that means something. And because I think it's very sophisticated, and but I want to home in on the same challenge a little bit more. And I thought I was very happy with, what is your name? Luca, and the other colleague over there, preempting my question. So, but I want to elaborate further with respect to how one can home in on final criteria of success. Because what you can set up is a set of relational conditions where you increase GFA and for instance more traffic builds up and certain regulatory envelopes are crossed, etc. And that becomes clear, and that is then becomes a search space which you can then rank according to these simple measures.
Yeah.
But what remains tacit in a way, this was just for your discussion tool, because the relative weighing and evaluation of these aspects become then a task for an intuitive, experienced developer to imagine and try to somehow, with this supercomputer that is his brain as a neural network, with its conditioning and black box, to make a judgment call. And that's what you're facilitating. And facilitating is sophisticated, so you can unburden some of these things which these decision makers wouldn't be able to compute. But the final criteria of success remain tacit. And they remain, and the bits and pieces you are operationalizing are things like regulatory envelope, maybe economic parameters that might be GFA, environmental parameters, traffic throughputs and such. So that's where the criticism comes, or where I would come in and would propose that there might be ways of operationalizing even those, in your case, still fully tacit, intuitive, only ineffable judgment calls. If one would, and my hint is, and I will try to, I'm not sure we'll have time to elaborate it, is through agent-based parametric semiology crowd modeling. A new kind of crowd, which isn't a traffic throughput crowd, but a crowd that is first of all differentiated. It's not one uniform mass. It's differentiated in various players, actors, interactors, maybe with different agendas, sometimes complementary, sometimes conflicting. I really like that reflection in your setup. but then, to some extent, with a sort of overarching creative success, which we could draw out of such a model, with respect to interaction density, interaction relevancy, encounter frequency, dwell time, the formation and gathering of a whole range of interaction scenarios, and the degree of, let's say, fluctuation rather than getting stuck in one system. This is the whole discourse of operationalizing the final end game. That would be fulfill we will substitute and make explicit what is in your model as of now remains tacit, and that's a crucial element.
Well, at the end of the day, like the model was meant to show a fully architectural sort of option every now and then. The idea is that at the end you try to get stakeholders to arrive to a. I mean, I guess one of the main.
You're helping them up to a point, but the critical judgment call is not further facilitated.
What do you mean? Like if what I mean that is not. The idea is that you try to thread your design intentions, your parametric sort of like ideas, agendas on the fabric diversity, granularity, etc. You try to thread them into discussions that you would never ever do if you just sit down and just give them an option.
But they don't care about any of this.
About
They don't care about any of this. Neither should we. We only care about this stuff, this brick and mortar stuff, with respect to being a kind of structure, text, platform for the life process that's meant to be unfolded, and that's what we care about.
But you know,
otherwise we're fetishizing.
But using these tools, you introduce the fact that you've already prefabricated them in discussions that initially you wouldn't be there because.
Look, all I'm saying is coming on top of this immense respect, appreciation. All of you guys, and Schumacher in particular, is one of my absolute star figures in the firm and in the field. It's just on top of all this, there remains that vacuum which I want to help fill in.
Okay. It's interesting. I find it fascinating. I think it's the fact that we open this.
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think the last project for us is opening a momentum. And I think I was a bit sad that Mario Carpo couldn't come in because I think his work is related to this momentum. Parametric models have a great potential in the way that because we code our design, we extract our ethos, so we are able to produce the essence of how do we understand the space, but leave it as an open framework. And I think in this particular moment, we can allow people to get in, and then you are starting to talk about this black box, but maybe this conversation is not and will never be explicit. It's through inner feelings.
And that's why there you too modest.
I don't know.
I've already crossed that line, so you're wrong with that. I mean, this never stops. There's no final frontier. We're only at the frontier, and the next step is making. Because if we are computing this, if it is possible, and it's possible in the material world, and we can enhance that, substitute that, even go further. So otherwise, we're kind of self-mutilating, or this kind of the inevitable becomes a kind of sacred veil we don't want to cross. Of course, we are crossing it. Never say never.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. That's yours. Yeah, this is the one that was here. It's just, it was not running.
Okay. Keep chatting, I'm not ready. I have to go to the bathroom also. Back in a minute, guys.
many versions. And they choose them. And then they choose the next one. And the song is really used to this. It's a computer. And it has a composition and basically maths. Seems to be yes. So I was going to say, I'll skip this around
almost about the torch. So these are the very good torches. I think that giving both languages at the same time. He's still deciding which one to start
Okay, guys. So, yeah, I think I decided that this little presentation is about the other protagonists and to analyze them. I mean, the book is full of the best and brightest, and what I consider to be the frontier of the discipline, as I said, highly valued, all of them, and really super sophisticated, and they should be awareness in any student of architecture or young architect of this work. And I guess you should all aspire to participate in this, and it's not something you can pick up in 5 minutes by flicking through a magazine and say, oh, I like this, let me try this. That's far more elaborate and onerous, and that just speaks to the advancement of the field. The field has achieved, after, say, 20 years of cumulative research and development according to a set of intuitions and purposes. Some of these intuitions have been theorized by a few, but then it's also intuitively felt that this is important and purposeful and sophisticated. I think that intuition and understanding it could be widespread, and I think what is said in a way that these distractions happen and a lot of people miss that boat. And that boat is only those few years of architecture school where you crack on or miss the boat. And I think that's the first message. And we have to be a little more aggressive in saying this. There are differences. And if it was 20 years ago, it was a matter of, I like this, I like that, let me try this, and quickly. That means that at that stage, the field was in disarray and chaos and confusion and had to restart and be reinvented after 50 years of modernism, which at the end game of modernism had also elaborated quite a bit of a sophistication, and it wasn't a trivial matter to catch up with the field. And we're in a similar stage. And I think that's the first thing I wanted to say, but I think the field is also, at the same time, primitive, as I said earlier, compared to other fields I've been, let's say, consuming, reading, and engaging with. It is. And you said earlier that I think architecture and urbanism is more of a humanities-based field when it comes to final purposes, and the way one has to conceive of the built environment. In humanities terms, I absolutely agree with that. And the technical framings are only an element of this. Now, the interesting question is when you mention humanities, then the humanities themselves have always been that literary genre, and which works with very much with intuition and nearly poetry at times, but that has changed. And that's important because the social sciences are now also becoming, most of all, not only much more scientific, but they're using the same tools. And I'm particularly encouraged as a let's say, lifelong aficionado of the field of sociology that we now, the next stage of advancement in this field is basically agent-based computational semiology, as well as economics, by the way, where you also build up the social interaction dynamics through agents, incentives, rules and constraints, and then you breed various societal arrangements and dynamics. You follow through, and then you rejig the rules, which might be legal interventions, or you reassume individual outlooks, incentives, and then run the dynamics. And this is what we are. And so these aspects are also now in the purview of, let's say, an explicit operational knowledge. And that's the context in which I'm thinking through. So it's a humanities, yes, as a first indication to say it's not an engineering problem, certainly not. And my architectural theory is all about that, grounding architectural theory in a social theory and theory of society historically. And what's new, and what are the new dynamics, and therefore the new challenges and opportunities for an urban built environment. So, and I think the attitude must be to dig into this and participate also in this venture, which at the moment is very, very lonely, but I'm very encouraged by somebody like Luca who's not afraid to just pick this up and run with this. And not be kind of stuck up that you have to have your own thoughts. And I have one eloquent disciple in the field of architecture who has been castigated as somebody who's just running after somebody. And that's a totally absurd attitude. Imagine that in the sciences. And that sees how kind of infantile the culture of architecture is. That you want to have your own little thing cooking. I mean, that's absurd. And with respect to my person, I'm in the shoes of giants, like everybody who's doing anything, within the field of architecture and the other framings. Because as an architectural theorist, one also has to think beyond the scope of one's field, not create original, for instance, sociology and social theory, but scan the field, identify the most convincing and compelling and relevant through theories, and embed one's own theory of the built environment and architecture within that. And that's what I've done. And that seems to me be absolutely compelling as a task. That I not only pose that task, but I've kind of worked through this task and have something put on the table which is flippantly ignored ever since I've put it there. So back to, so this is at the moment as far as we've got, and it's super sophisticated, but it is vacuous at its very heart, as I said, and that vacuum can only be filled by tying back an understanding of how the built environment functions, what its contribution is with respect to social order and social evolution. And then an understanding what the contemporary society's dynamic are and how one ties in with this, and what then the architectural discipline's contribution to the built environment is, because there are many disciplines coming together to shape and form it and move it forward. Within a context which is largely market-driven, and that's something else I've also reflected, that this new market-based urbanization process, these new drivers aren't to be rejected out of some kind of distaste and hankering on the power of the architect when he was just working for central planners and how nice it was to lay out Brasilia. Or some other kind of unquestioned left liberal, intellectually bankrupt, but hankering on prejudices which the discipline is filled to the hilt with. And yes, as a leading architectural theorist and leader of the discipline, I put that claim down. I have to, of course, also be conversant with respect to the latest socioeconomic and political theory approaches, and there's a convergence there. So the architects are backward on that level too. This much as a premise. Now I want to go to some of the protagonists. What? Where's the picture?
Slowly dimming lamps.
Oh, okay. Okay, right. So yeah, I'm not gonna. Of course, I can't elaborate the theory of architectural autopoiesis now, but I'm just pointing toward it, and I'm readily available to work with anybody who has a genuine interest and the capacity to drill in through whatever means necessary, whether it's Facebook messaging, Twitter messaging, emailing, or engagements here and elsewhere in a one-to-one or in seminars. Because I realize that it makes no sense to throw these publications into a void. I think we don't have pictures. So what I wanted to talk about was, I mean, I've picked out, I left Theo alone, but picked harshly on Rob and Shajay, and now on Eduardo and Enriqueta, slightly more softer because we're not so familiar with each other. This is just purely due to the enormous respect I have for you guys, because you have so many things in your capacities which I only understand from a distance, but and would love to participate with, but you know, these capacities are yours, and I include in this, of course, other characters like Achim Menges, who's enormous respect for, as well as Mark Fawns, who's been coming out of this DRL and ZHA ambit as well. So I wanted to refer to their work also and indicate. I mean, I've recently I'm also ramping up the agenda for ZHA, and the direction we've been traveling on was precisely in the direction to what these protagonists in this magazine are representing and offering, right? And of course, the way this is put forward is not a trivial matter, that we have now the repertoires and degrees of freedom we've conquered in parametricism at the earlier stage, with and without certain tools, but soon with tools, is all about that the new degrees of freedom, the versatility of pouring into complex site conditions, absorbing contingencies, arranging complex intersecting and multiple and very varied programs and urban textures. So that's the initial one. That just shows up as what contemporary post-fordist network society needs. It doesn't have these 5 zones, each with endlessly repeated stereotypes locked in there and then laid out on the green field like Brasilia. That was great for what it was and what it was delivered. And now we're in a totally different era. And that's the first message on multiple scales to deliver. And then we homed in, I guess, quite soon on splines and NURB surface and NURB modeling and so on, and that got us somewhere. And but why I'm pushing for and I'm interested in to add constraints to this. No images is okay. Maybe I don't need them. I think you all have the pictures in your head of the work of Achim and Mark and Shadje's team and what we've been trying and also what's coming out of Theo's work and Rob's work, etc., is in the first instance, of course, yes, these forms are now rule-based and disciplines by logic we have to address anyway, sooner or later, which is structural logics. And these are structural optimization logics, maybe environmental flow and channeling, fabrication concerns and conditions, folded in and pre-constraints. Now this makes life, of course, initially difficult, more difficult, and it requires higher level of skills from us, but also it then makes downstream life much easier. And we do find these constraints important. But none of you are architects, and you're exploring that search space, I think, for reasons where you also feel and say that this is about the architectural project after all. But then we don't know what it is. And that needs to be elaborated. And I also feel, and when I promoted this into the office, that it can't be just those technical functionality advantages. They're not trivial, they're not unimportant. Of course, it's also the stimulating element of a more sophisticated process, but we also are not design process fetishists. Initially, it also makes life more difficult, and we're not in there to make our life more difficult, but we see that the final analysis, we're more potent and more light-footed. So also always in a temporary and interim condition of an avant-gardist movement, condoned the fact that we are going at the hard way by working with algorithms, something you would quickly sketch and don't have it under control, and when we place product next to product, it is less functional, more expensive, but the intuition, of course, that in the end it is more functional and less expensive. Here we go. So then we need to also see that we have to have a systematic tolerance in a research condition, for sure, but also in a whole movement and discipline where this has to be protected, and you can't have this kind of lambasted too early that this is not delivering. It is not yet delivering. But I think a lot of people intuitively realize that it will deliver, and the time of deliverance is with us. with projects like this, global retrospective efforts. And now I want to talk about, when Achim does these pavilions, and of course the great precursor is Frei Otto also, where this kind of idea of finding form and harnessing logics of nature. Yes, there's a lightness in some of these projects which is unprecedented with respect to span, and that's wonderful, but there's also something more, which is, this is in fact handing over what otherwise would be we staring at a white sheet of paper and imagining forms to another force. And that's precisely what even somebody like Eisman, who's not doing any of these constraints, he said, we go into automatic writing, we have to actually cut out our imagination because it's so repetitive, routine, and infertile. Right? So one proposition is, what we're really doing here, and I called Achim a proto-engineer, and that's true to the fact that we have to push the engineers into this world of form, but that's our a priori. This comes on the top of these, now in retrospect only, indispensable nerve surface, playful proliferation of forms, whose rationality was highly questionable, and we should not, and it's really sad to see some of the last Bybrook in retrospect, not understanding what this meant, and that this was a precursor necessity to reach here. He called this, I'm no longer into this kind of pink pudding or something. But that, so first of all, this needs to be reflected that there's a certain morphological complexity a priori, and that isn't something willful. It's not only that we can do it, but that the city demands it of us, because it spontaneously generates complexities, even if it's left alone through its kind of spontaneous market of informations. But I think it's also important to see here, when we go this way, that it is becoming that engine of formal invention. And of course, formal invention is not a final destination, but it's a necessary step to have an expanded repertoire and search space, because these formal repertoires and opportunities become, of course, solution spaces for delivering according to the final success criteria of architecture. And this is not only different organizational morphologies, but when you see that each of these, this is very different from an herb surface, right? This has its own character, identity. It's very particular expressiveness, inverted commas. And these phrases are important, and they have been in architecture for a long time. They brought into 18th century architecture theory through the theater. But it means something. Something has character, has identity, and expressiveness and meaning. But look at, these are all quite different. And there's a whole range now of opportunities in formal language. Of course, they also share an overall set of values and principles with respect to malleability and open-endedness. That's the overarching principles of parametricism, but they are very abstract. And what flourishes under their umbrella, which is the endless forms, nearly of nature, so far more expansive and diverse and varied than all the previous styles put together, and that's often forgotten. Oh, you want everybody to be parametricism, so how are you clamping down? But this world is just hugely more fertile and more intelligent and has new ordering capacities. But you see, each of these is very, very different and unique, and we had to go this way nearly to stay within parametricism and yet come out of and beyond just simple NURB surfaces, right? Which we locked in too much, and that's what we have to get out of. Not only for reasons that this is lighter and more effective technology, no, for the core competency of architecture to have an expanded repertoire of morphologies for the articulation of, in the final analysis, of the semiological project, and I come to elaborate this a bit more, but that repertoire expansion is something we urgently want and intuit, and now I'm explaining also how this becomes instrumental, the instrumentality of appearances, the information-rich environment, phrases which I'm so happy to see, and the communicative capacity of the built environment resides in here. all these different conditions versus just the range of different shapes within a NURB surface. And that's just, and there's ability to, of course, these are at the moment still single system. I know for a long time that we have to be multi-system, and these are, maybe the second system is the landscape in each case, which these ties into. Okay, this was Achim, and Achim is, again, when he lectures, the true urge and rational, what I have to be calling free-floating because it's unreflective, it's just, and tacit, he remains a blank, also in Achim. Now, the problem I have is that's why I'm ramping up. Have I told him? Have I written? Have I challenged him? Yes. Is it sinking in? No. So and it's the same with Mark. I mean, Mark has been with us here and at the firm, and I've taught with him a wonderful studio at Harvard, and the same challenges remain. But you see the richness. I mean, this is within the world of parametricism with all its advantages of having privilege and curvilinearity, because when you have complexity building up, curvilinearity is crucial to maintain legibility, intractable and perceptual perspicuity and palpability in the face of complexity. And yet there are so many different ranges. And of course, how does he come up with this? Purely through basically forcing himself into a corner of having a nearly absurd constraint where he's handcuffing his hands behind his shoulder and says, I'm going to do my geometries through these kind of small pieces and the 2D patterning embedding back into the 3D proliferation, and then there's a certain kind of tectonic articulation in them. And yes, it would have been impossible to come up with this straight on in a kind of direct intentionality, I just need more diversity of graphics or of articulation, of a richer language or semiology. So that's the methodological interesting thing, which Eisenman discovered. Or people discovered when they went to aleatoric processes or threw themselves into some kind of alien physics machine, and that includes the alien physics of the rapid hand movement, of a perspectival construction gone mad, etc., etc. But this is but you can do it through pure ornament, through graphics. This is unfortunately a bit blurry. It's an interesting space. This is just black paint patches in a space, and that for these two worlds, for me, this is as good as the other, to some extent, nearly, when it comes to the end game of architecture, to creating these atmospheres, to pull through, to articulate, to create a network of similitude and contrast. But why am I still privileging the other? Because I still have to build. And architecture always economized in terms of, and the ornament is a very profound semiological stratum in the built environment forever, but it was always driven out of the stone layering, the things you needed it anyway, the tiling, the tessellation, and then enhanced and heightened into some kind of ornamental condition. And I think that there's also an element when you use structure to express the identity and character, this versus that space, the large versus small, the high versus low, and environmental, the perforation here, exposing certain functionality requirements and also light conditions, then you, rather than kind of covering all that structure and then painting patterns, of course, there's an element of, let's say, a sense of compelling truth-telling. You know, the structure doesn't lie, but maybe the wallpaper. There's a certain credibility issues which I appreciate when you're talking about the real physical performance drivers being drawn in to become the articulating medium. Of course, you have to have many structural options, and the proliferation of that, and all pragmatic subsystems, you have to have many to then select them according to a totally alien new criterion, which is the articulated communicative capacity criterion. And that's the architect's task. It's bringing in the compositional stance to draw in. But the proliferation of material potentials and structures and so on is so large that we can't do that. That we can home in and find these, let's say, serendipitous coincidences of two totally alien performance criteria. The actual physical structural performance and the communicative capacity that this delivers. And then there are, within certain spaces of the structural engineering, there are certain, I think, let's say, call them nearly like pre-established harmonies or biases, again, serendipitous, like all of the biological world is coming out of serendipitous synergies and refunctionalizations of things originally purposed for other things. Is, for instance, that in the structural optimization discourse, you have actually this kind of wonderful differentiation logic and gradient logics. But in our social logic, we have differentiation of audiences and tasks, and we're not a stereotypical marching armies, but we have subtly differentiated situations and they gradate from one into the other. So you can use that map gradient on gradient, etc. And that's why we're going back to some of these, and Mark Burry is another one. So this is yet another morphological world, and what I also like about these, once you have them rule-driven and consistent, there is a sense of coherence and cohesiveness which unifies across. And this rule-based proliferation of form delivers something else with respect to the information richness of these morphologies. Why? Because if they are rule-driven, and particular one set of rules scripting onto another set of differentiated conditions, for instance, a settlement scripting onto topography, or an envelope onto a skeleton, if there has been a rule-based mapping from one onto the other, one of the key dogmas, principles of parametricism is not only always differentiated, but also correlate so that these things resonate with each other. So if you work like this, if you have transcoding from one system to the other and they're both present, one becomes a representation of the other. One informs you from the other. That's what they call in German, in mathematical mapping. Abbildung is precisely that word. And so every layer, every subsystem becomes actually a representation of the subsystem has driven it, and there might be multiple. And that's the way actually an animal would actually navigate nature when it can read, when it knows where the water is, because the rule relative to how water carves through topography, and the vegetation follows that, and the fauna follows that, and in the end, these things are all laws of nature. This is all rule-based, and the calculation and emergence that's why we're talking about material computation. The whole world is materially computed, except that garbage spill urbanization, which we inhabit, and which is disarticulate, and everything is random, and there's no information richness in a sense of inference capacity, because if you map one onto the other, you infer back from one to the other, and that's what I call information richness. So that's also within these structures. But you couldn't have come up with that. This is not an invention. This is rigorously rule-based and handing over the artistic and sort of impotency which we all have, because what we do with our imagination is sort of recalculating things we've seen. That's the fertility, that's what we should cherish. And of course, the structural capacity and rationality comes as an added bonus, which we run with, and saves economy, and in the passive system saves lots of let's say plant space and heavy beams and heavy slabs and heavy walls is of course prohibiting in a more direct way the organizational, let's say, permeability of your structure. So here again, this is not to be trivialized, but this is the repertoire of the semiological project. It's essentially what we should look at this as architects and our core competency. And then we have in the design team the engineers who are responsible, and our selection will coincide. In the end, we have coinciding selections, synergies, if you like, serendipitous coincidences. And we do that ourselves as well. And it is eminently clear what the diversity and range of unity across difference and difference out of unity and the sequencing of degrees of formality perhaps, and importance in this kind of social institution and how you articulate this. And of course, this is something which comes natural. This is a whole different discourse. How do you build up actually a system of signification? Is somology built up not of inherent meanings, but of a network of mutually defining, internally defining system dynamics creates meaning, and there's never an inherent meaning. And we've done, so these are still the kind of NURB surface projects. They're not to be dismissed. In retrospect, they are to be criticized. So there's a wonderful example of this idea of a genotype and different phenotypical condition adaptation. There's a certain, there's always these 3 points. There's cantilever, there's the interaction of two systems. Each of us has a tectonic rule set. The concrete behaves differently from the glass, etc., etc. And there's a wonderful project, but in respect to where we are now, it's undisciplined. And to be further disciplined, this is still in this range. This is the last one, the large one of the, let's say, relatively speaking, undisciplined parametricism projects, but also, still on that scale, global best practice until we make the next move. This and two. These are, we don't have them in large. These are more, once you bring in the tensile, you can't just model as you wish. There's certain logic, and again, it picks up a different morphology and character, identity and logic. And we scaling those up, and this was Shajay, yeah, and here we go, for instance, criminally rejected. Something I thought very certain to do, something to look forward for 2020, and it's been taken away. But that's the outcome of this, and I think it is within that very, very, and it speaks, right? There's character, and our aesthetic sensibility registers. We've grown up in nature where these kind of logics and what is an organic unity versus an accidental coincidence, and we've sensitized those. So in terms of my theory of aesthetic values and aesthetic sensibilities, there's a strong historical evolution. We have to relearn it all the time. That's why we need radical aesthetic revolutions. But there's an underlying invariance and constants, which are called the order versus chaos aspect of this. This is just showing that if you work with systems and rules and constraints and form finding, how you can generate these unique, and of course these are single systems. In my world, starting now with the studio at the moment, is to have multi-species ecologies, because these things can be grow through each other, over each other, combine, resonate, and cajole and into a kind of jungle-like nearly complexity of an urban environment, rather than this kind of single system purity. And this is some of the GSD projects, but it's not only structure, it's also environmental, the differentiation of something which is lawfully correlated to light and shade, and then look back, it reorients you. Even on an overcast day, you know where's the sun coming from, where is it, and et cetera, and you can also map, sun exposure map, it would recognize adjacent buildings, would imprint, if you optimize for that, onto your structure and therefore be read off the structure. So the building becomes, in a sense, a fulcrum, a holograph of all these ongoings which imprint on it. The idea of deformation, registering information. I mean, but this insight was already there. This was what we've discussed 25 years ago, in the early 90s. And again, more tensile structures. So. And how this is orchestrated through a ruthless formalism which ties these things together, this orchestration under an architectural formalist will, but with a purpose. How do you, in that disaggregation of the suburban outskirts, and the idea of placing a car park, a train station, and a bus station, you can imagine how this would disappear in the garbage spill if you would just put it down. One car park here, etc. It would just be that more of that stuff, right? If you allow that pragmatics, which all you guys are at the moment able to talk about, with a degree of confidence. If you would live up to your own rationality constraints, you would generate this. Because we are shy, we are shamefaced when it comes to the compositional stance, the formalist project, but that's not the end game. It is an attitude which becomes, in the final analysis, fully functional social performance functionality. Because social performance, social functionality lives off us as sentient, perceptually cognitive beings grasping and identifying units of interactions in an environment, which this is very hard to separate the unit of interaction against background and understand what ties together, what belongs together, what moves with what. And it is hard. And if you look at the Bauhaus, you don't know which pieces are inherently belonging together. And if this would sit in another arrangement of buildings, it would disintegrate. It would be totally disorienting. And that's what modernism delivers: degrees of freedom, but a degeneration of the ordering and communicative capacity. And in the article, you see that funny graph: freedom and order. And there's this entropic slide for 300 years. And then there's a turning point in my lifetime line. And then it kind of soars. And that's parametricism. That coincidence of what for each new style conquers new degrees of freedom, but paying for it with a further generation of the ordering capacities and communicative capacities. When you move from the Baroque to the neoclassical, to the historicism, to modernism, to postmodernism and deconstructivism, it's a downward slide. Yes, you have more versatility, but you end up with this kind of unadjustable chaos, which is actually what we're seeing out in the world. And deconstructivism is, in some sense, the progressive element of this. And this is all progress. Because the degrees of freedom are an inevitable requirement. That whole graph is progress. There's always progress. There's no backsliding, except you go retro. We've progressed, and now 90% of our field goes retro. It's totally unacceptable. They're so bankrupt. They're so beyond the pale. But we're quite happily kind of, that's why ramping up the rhetoric is the game. Otherwise, we will not make history. Actually, we're wasting. We're back to 30. We're talking about the neo-rationalism. And so the disciplines kind of striving and theorizing and urging comes to zero. If that's really happening, I'm exiting the discipline. I'm out of here. If that doesn't come through soon, I'm literally out of here. Anyway, I just flick through this. So everything becomes an element in a compositional graphic, furring a field condition which pulls you in, and you assimilate demarcation lines with lampposts, with columns, and these slashes in light slashes and demarcation lines. And you can do that. They're perfectly viable and functional, because there's always multiple, many, and increasingly many ways of fulfilling a function. So you just need to bring them on. You can bring them on the most ruthless formalism to select out of the 1,000 that one string which becomes a composition. And why a composition? Well, because you can only navigate compositions in this sense. Or else you're kind of thrown into the garbage spill. So in a way, we have to look at the built environment. That's the architectural way of looking at the built environment, not it's shelter. Shelter is in the engineering project, right? You don't get wet. It's a physical. It doesn't collapse. The wild beasts are out, and we're just protecting ourselves. That's what That's still animal kingdom. What we have to realize is that the built environment is an absolutely crucial arena of building up larger cooperative groups which need to be structured. They can't be just kind of 25 apes naked roaming around without. They have some kind of structure where they can recognize each other and find little bands, and somebody from another band is killed actually with chimpanzees. So but it's not going to be 150, 250, 500, 5,000 naked bodies delivering no matter what their cognitive capacities are, they couldn't generate a society, right? There couldn't be a unified, integrate, let's say, social organism without having some kind of structure which structures and regulates, you can cling onto. And this is here, this image is kind of social order, a game plane, a playing field, a structure, social structure embedded in space, and it must be embedded in space. Where else? We're living in space. And it's a graphic project. I like this, that you could look at it as a purely graphic project. I sometimes have this hypothesis, imagine in California, a 1 million city, nice gray rubber surface, nice weather, no wind. Throw 1 million naked bodies on there, because this is also a design, articulation, semiology. You know that the society cannot function. 1 million naked bodies on a gray rubber surface? Society disintegrates on the spot. No chance. So we need this. This is the way we have to look at this. And you can see that you can structure status groups, routines, institutions, interaction patterns and sequences, and you distinguish the players, those who belong, don't belong, who have access, rights, and you can have rights of transition from one into the other. That graphic overlay is absolutely essential, because the pure pragmatic morphology of these isn't enough to distinguish the social valency. That's the semiological encoding, basically, of what? Of the social interaction meaning, and this is, this is a human society, and this is not. And the difference is cultural evolution, and cultural evolution needs some kind of physically cross-generational stable material substrate of inscribing, of mutating, selection, reproduction, in which you can elaborate an information structure. It must be physical substratum. Where is it? It's the built environment. That's the DNA of the cultural evolution, and it couldn't be. So that's moving from the animal kingdom, becoming human, becoming society. These are equivalent. Sanford Quinter has it absolutely wrong if he thinks it's just a question of the brain size. No matter how big your brain is, and you throw these 1 million naked bodies onto a rubber surface, no society will emerge. No language can emerge. Language co-evolves with these demarcations. There's another lecture I have in terms of the logic of making distinctions, classifications. These are lines drawn, distinctions into space. Subdivision, subsumption logics are enclosure logics. The Aristotelian syllogism is the transitivity of the enclosure relation becomes a logical inference relation, etc. And so this is not funny and stupid. This is absolutely necessary, and there's not a single society in the world which remains naked, because it just couldn't. So all of this is instrumental, life necessary. Why would these people who are on the edge of poverty spend all this energy in making these funny things onto their head? I mean, this is an enormous amount of work and labor and energy which they could go and seeking out food. No, nothing is for free. That's a kind of R&D process. Of course, it's a free-floating Russian. They don't know why they're doing it really, truly, but those who didn't start doing this perished or remained apes. That's the way the evolution. This, of course, took several millions of years to reach this, and then it kind of proliferates. But we're still doing this, right? We're still expressing our identity, and we're totally navigating the world aesthetically based on these fashion systems. They're not on top, excess. The fashion system is hard work and an absolute essential. And it goes to a lot of other things, like religion also. So it's a bit like this. That's what the urban matrix is. It's a chessboard. And it could have different, it doesn't matter. You could play chess with all these. So it's degrees of freedom, because it's ultimately a semiological system. And you don't home in on the individual. Meaning only retrieves itself through a system of differences. And that's what the insight came very late in the 20th century, Saussure, post-fordist. Of course, that's the key reference in my book. And when I'm going through setting up the semiological project, that's the key competency. And then there's a phenomenological project also, that you need to kind of distinguish first before you know and ascribe meaning to something. You need to distinguish it against its background. look, the last point making. So what are these meanings? These meanings are the social situations, interaction scenarios, and and how they constitute out of individual behavioral rules. Wherever we are, wherever we move, we have a stack of behavioral options, and they change as I'm moving across a threshold from one space into another, from the public sidewalk into this lobby or into private garden. Each place is encoded with a set of instructions to me, and I know how I have to behave and what I can expect, and therefore bottom-up individuals who are brought together onto this plane and structured through that matrix of shared understanding of a situational definition can then aggregate into an overall gestalt, which is a social situation scenario. But we can build it up with agent-based semi-logical crowds, bottom-up, and these crowds are not the engineering crowds which are now just pushing particles through evacuation channels and just throughput measures, but they are semiologically informed. They have that whole stack of behavioral codes which we run around with and which are then triggered by understanding where we are, complementary, it's not always everybody in the same pitch, but sometimes complementary, cooperative conditions. And this is the last hint, and then I can also simulate this and then measure out the criteria of success, which in the end the host, the client, society would like to get out of the environments it offers, whether it's a conference center, it's a cafeteria, it's whatever it is, the kind of interaction measures which might be relevant. I mentioned earlier interaction and counter frequency, interaction density, range of interactions you're going through, would come out of this. And you can be inventive about certain institutions, this kind of little lecture hall which peters out and transmorphs and morphs and gradients out into a more informal condition, rather, and only those here at the front know what they're paying attention to. There's a coming and going. So you can be inventive about it, and you can not only draw something, but you can show us and your client and know yourself what it means. So what I'm saying, I'm ending with, that we need to don't work off a schedule of accommodation with a list of boxes and labels, with square meters. We need to understand those 500 or 5,000, and it mostly makes sense in larger, complex interaction scenarios. Let's say Google Campus. We need to bring them in. We need to see what they have to do with each other, how they associate and reassociate, what they're looking for, what their valencies are, what their knowledge is, and we bring them somehow into the model in degrees of orchestration as little dots. And then when we draw up and build up the space and put in the gradients, we draw lines, distinctions, we bifurcate that group, we make openings so there's a permeability, and we keep drawing and working on the space, but we are working on these walls, ceilings, channels, steps, soffits, but we're watching what the crowds are doing. We don't care about the stuff. We only care what this stuff is doing to the interaction and communication scenarios. So these have to be, and that's the core competency. That this stuff is not falling down, that's engineering business. What this stuff does for the orchestration, channeling, cajoling, pulling through, and so on, and this could also be augmented now, these things are moving, flexing, robotic, and so on, we still have to watch, only watch and care about what these characters are doing, and therefore I'm saying an architectural model which doesn't have, in whatever degree of abstraction, from dot to final, full-on 3D kinetic, where you see the nuance, what this means, how you sit the space, and what this expresses, a sofa and so on. What is this difference between a sofa very relaxed and up, and what's the valency? What it means, you can model, you can not only, you can actually home in on it, and that's the architectural discipline, that's an architectural model. If there are no crowds in a model, it's not an architectural model. So in a way, it's a shame to say to you guys, none of what these models you're creating are architectural models. Now, you have all these robots in there and all the flying drones and all of that, which are simultaneously with the event supposedly structuring this, but this event is never there. So that's the vacuum. And I've said it a few times, and I'm putting it down. Sorry, joking. That's it. Debate? Helen? Are you coaching us? Or should we? Yeah, I think we should directly debate. I mean, then the Q&A comes in.
Shall I start with some questions?
Yeah, should we sit around or not?
Yeah.
No. This mouse. That was.
I want to ask two questions.
Okay.
Uh,
1, 2, 3, great.
one to the speakers and one to Patrik.
Okay.
I think what I want to do is I want to really kind of focus outwards a little bit. We've had strong individual presentations, so I want to kind of think much more about the theme of the issue. What does it mean, both in the current climate and historically? So I want to ask you how you feel about, and we play devil's advocate here, how do you feel about being bracketed as part of a style, as part of a formal movement? Do you think it's helpful, or is it a little bit uncomfortable now? And where does that sit with you?
Great question. Love it. It's tricky, isn't it?
I should have prepped you, shouldn't I? That was a bit unfair.
No, never. Never prep.
I mean, to be honest, I don't feel uncomfortable. I don't feel uncomfortable with my work at all.
Yes.
And the fact that it's being brought into this like stream, I don't have any problem. I guess, I don't know, I have a strong character, I stand by my work, so I'm never uncomfortable. But I think somehow for me, as a new generation, so I don't think I participated in the Parametricism 1. So for me, what is interesting is to build the knowledge of what happened, that I was not part of it, and how maybe the way Eduardo and I work together also, I am a social scientist, not only an architect, have taken somehow some of the potential that we saw and brought it to a completely different direction. So for us, it's like, I think Patrik said it, we stand on the shoulders of giants. So having all this repertoire as a starting base is actually very good for us. It's inspiring, yeah, I would say.
What about you, Sajid? You talked about historical references, placing yourself. How do you feel about it?
About being branded
Parametricist.
well, I'm not. I mean, it's not something that I actively considered. I mean, I perhaps have the benefit of like actually working with Patrik like on a daily basis. So it's not something that I've considered as like a brand or something to be branded. Like it, always thought that what Patrik is saying is, in a way, giving voice to younger people, or collecting a range of interests that we were naturally interested in anyway, and kind of collecting it into a larger discourse. And so in that sense, I have not really considered it being branding. It just kind of provides the umbrella in a way, like so.
What about you, Phil?
Me. Interesting question. No, I'm happy to participate. I mean, from my perspective, and I think in my talk I tried to sort of open up the conversation by considering it more a conversation. So I think over the years we may have started from very different places, maybe more top-down, bottom-up kind of strategies, but working together over the time and actually working with our students particularly, I think trying to sort of expand the field in terms of how we work, I think is really important. So I came from working into very formal practices like Eisenman's and for a short time at Zaha's. And so for me, I had certain questions that is nothing against the formal project, but there were questions that, let's say, were from my generation, and it was by necessity that I had to step out of that world to actually be able to identify what was, for my own practice, very important.
So defining yourself within that or outside?
Well, just questions for me, and particularly with respect to communication. I think communication's vital. I was very interested in generative systems and looking at things that were coming from more informal to formalized, scenario-driven kind of strategies. And over that time, I think that that's kind of co-evolved into something which like, I don't have a problem if someone sees the work from a parametric perspective, just in the same way there have been other people that have seen some of the work that we do as triple O or whatever this means. At some level, no, I mentioned that mostly because I feel like if it's a framework that actually challenges the work that I'm doing, I find it a very useful thing. And let's say in terms of the synergy of what Patrik is doing, I think the motivation behind that is really to kind of bring a greater kind of convergence of people together. So for me, I find that very beneficial. And part of that benefit, I think, is also to challenge each other in a good way. I think in terms of today's event, we've had a lot of DRL people here. And you can see that Patrik will challenge Sajay and Rob or myself. He's challenged me for 15 years, so the fact that he didn't call me out today doesn't really mean very much. But I mean, I think that this is a very healthy thing. So I like it because it's very design-focused, and anything that for me celebrates design and tries to situate it in a more contemporary context, and I think Patrik is doing that, I'm happy to sort of participate in.
Can I come in just briefly on this? Because, of course, it's the way the field operates with and its kind of underlying, let's say, culture and ideology to some extent. There is maybe a natural or a bred resistance to being encompassed into something, being pigeonholed, and it seems to be limiting to some, and they want to be their own kind of little self. And I think that's been something which generated a lot of resistance. This, in general, just any pigeonholing, but then the phrase of style, of course, was an additional one because it had been accumulated a lot of negative connotations. But I've tried to argue that it remains an inevitable category of the field. But I also want to come back to when we're talking about the formal project. I mean, I've been struggling with this for over 20 years now, when the foundation of DL was precisely about bringing together, let's say, that formalism of at that time was, Eisenman, Kipnis, Folding, etc., which is actually very productive here at the A. When I was just earlier at Zahadid in 91, Jeff had this aggressive re-evaluation of castigated values. Formalism became a positive term. And I agree with that you need to have a sub-project, I call it. There needs to be a discourse on formal repertoires, a vocabulary distinguishing, describing morphologies, forms, formal approaches, compositional, and architecture always had that. And it is required to then ask the question, which formal repertoires and formal options and compositional options would become solutions for the performances one would expect. And I never understood that dichotomy, and somehow that. But what is interesting is it seems to be hard to synthesize two contrarian, let's say, trains of thoughts and rationalities, because they were confronting each other in the field. For instance, OMA, MDV, and a whole group of people were interested in the programmatic element and aspects, and thought program innovation is important, and would reject and are mute about formal strategies, and their formal strategies were rather simplistic, as if they don't matter, as if it was just about arranging programs. But what wasn't reflected, that there was a formal a priori, the formal a priori of the rectangle, and that an arrangement was just be shifting boxes. Now this is very myopic. So there's a formal a priori limiting, and on the other hand, you have Eisenman and Kipnis systematically rejecting that this should ever have anything to do with programmatic issues, because they were wanting to proliferate and innovate on the formal level. Now, the way I said these things, two things have to be brought together: new programmatic arrangements with new forms, and that congeniality was the theoretical project. But also, and then I came to reflect and realize that resistance has to do with the difficulty of being, for instance, a radical formal innovator, while at the same time already with that very process and project burdening that, and in a sense cutting down on, too early burdening this exploration with quite tough and difficult to meet performance criteria. You literally can't. You can't do it simultaneously, particularly in a research arena. So the way I theorize, and then yes, we have to invest in this and let this flow, but we have to not do what Eisenman and Kipnis doing, say this is never to be, but we say it will come later and let it flow. And then once I've generated formal structures, then I look at, and if somebody else has here generated new performance constraints and issues, a new kind of sociology, if you like, then we need to see whether this offers a solution for that. And this is so hard, and I call it in Marxist terms a kind of nearly necessarily false consciousness, because these guys had to unburden themselves, throw off that joke, and then they just radicalized and made it absolute. But as in a division of labor of the field, it was actually quite good to have ruthless and radical formalists who couldn't care less, because if they cared, there couldn't be that engine of invention, and the other way around. So and then I come in and said, okay, and then I'm synthesizing and bring it together. And the same thing, and just to finish this, is in a sense you guys, where if you'd already know too early on that what you're seeking with these things is actually graphics and characterization, semiology repertoires, maybe you're looking for a shortcut. You know, so it's because you have to kind of tie yourself to this so much, maybe that you don't see that other opportunity, and that there's another option. I see that parallel a little bit. I wouldn't say it so strictly, but that there is a kind of systematic, for order to what you do to do really, really well, you have to kind of disburden yourself from the larger project I'm seeing. This may be also the case, but I think in the end, you got to be enlightened and then go back to your division of labor and tie in, and not be shy to also pick up those and reference back to me and my agendas like I do to you, right? We're working on different things, but it synthesizes, and I think that needs to be happening, and we can't be shy about this being absorbed into or being defined by something. We need to pick that up and run with it, and not just resist it intuitively. And I've had these arguments too many times about that's for me the frustrating thing, that for instance, as if the concept of style would still be just this kind of superficial thing, which people who reject the phrase insist on it is, and patently, the way I can demonstrate historically and in my intentionality, it isn't that superficial. element.
I mean, I wanted to say, really, in that regard, the kind of discomfort within the architectural community, you're picking up the baton from someone like Charles Jenks, but you're from in practice, so you're in a way, you've got a double identity there, which makes it much more controversial.
Charlie Jenks, I mean, he's been a force in the field, and the language of postmodern architecture and the phrase postmodernism is incredibly potent and important, which then set up the search for the next stage, deconstructivism. I witnessed all this, so that's why I thought, what's next? And it was quite strategic, and poor Charlie Jenks was incredibly upset that he didn't come up with this, because he saw it his task in history to have always define the point and moment and come up with the coinage. But at least I'm coinciding with him to this extent, that it's an important aspect. There's a kind of the name and marker as an engine of, or accelerator of convergence, and also as a polemic demarcation against other possibilities, I think is important. And we have to, I know from other contexts, that there is also always the requirement of the headline and the subsidiary headline, and then there's smaller elaborations, small print. It's not always only small print. You got to put out a flag and a banner and the first kind of slogan in order to intervene in the discourse. And we shouldn't be shy about this. And it doesn't mean, of course, it makes you vulnerable, but I don't see it as an alternative. And again, it might have been slightly less controversial if I just used the phrase kind of paradigm, because that comes from another discipline of science and seems to be something which more palatable to people. But I didn't want to do that because I think it's too easy. I think there needs to be a bit of a rubbing against the grain, and also I wanted the internally relevant category, because they're absolutely parallel, actually. What is a paradigm in science is a style in architecture. And that's been elaborated in the book as well. So.
I've got one more question for you. I'm mindful of the fact that the audience, so I'm going to put in my final question, and then I think we should ask the audience for some questions. And my final question is really to do with the title of the issue is Parametricism 2.0. And there's an incredibly acerbic article in the back of the issue by Mark Foster Gage, who's provided the counterpoint.
It's atrocious. and I think, I don't know, I mean, the polite, let's say...
He's forgotten about politeness.
No, I mean, but the polite rule of editing is you invited somebody and you take whatever rubbish he's throwing at you. I mean, it's just so terribly primitive and stupid and idiotic and vile and vicious, and then he's pandering his own ludicrous comic strip pieces there under a kind of an absurd halo of claptrap pseudo-philosophy. I mean, we had a conversation, we wanted to have a debate and so on, but he hasn't even read any of the articles. He's kind of regurgitated some kind of polemic here, where he's written 3 lines into my book. He knows it. I mean, I'm seeing him in Yale. He's looking past me. I'm still friendly. I'm never resentful, but it's just not worth our airtime to talk any more about this.
Mark, but I am going to say that he thinks that parametricism is dead. But what do you anticipate parametricism 3.0 being?
Well, okay. Oh, this is so alive and kicking. It's so. I mean, look at what's in here, and look at these wonderful, deep, and bright and intelligent presentations, and what they mean. These are all collective projects which condense into this, and then compare it to Marx's kind of cartoons. That's really no comparison at all. No, that's really the trivial. That's this idea that I'm getting bored with this. There's something new coming around the corner, and always something new, as if it was a kind of arbitrary fashion cycle. That's really a very, very shallow way of thinking, and of course I'm addressing in the issue that this convergence has kind of, the proliferation and takeoff hasn't happened for reasons to do with the socioeconomic crisis, and there's no work, there's nothing going on, and all the political upheavals which follow from that, and the self-criticism that we as a movement haven't been speaking to this. And therefore we couldn't entertain and engage. I did, by the way, but to some extent. And that's why this was some of this steam has been pulled out because there wasn't all that work to the same extent, and there was this, let's say, ideological lacuna, a vacuum to some extent within the movement, at the core of the movement. And one person is enough to fill that or become clear about it. These are the reasons why this is, but this is moving forward because that's the, as I say, the solution to the computationally empowered post-fordist network society civilization. That's the style. I mean, who else is picking and running with these new intelligencies and delivers these versatilities, contingencies, ties in with the market-driven conception of order and so on. So this is very clear, and this goes on. I don't know how long it goes on. This for decades, if it may. And we can't. There's, in terms of evolution from style to style, in terms of the category of epochal styles, we really, the new transition to something else would really require a momentous shift in the socioeconomic, let's say, and political constitution of society and world society. That shift from the mechanical age, for instance, to the kind of computationally enhanced, micro-rhetorically driven age, and all that which comes and hangs on this categorization of Fordism to post-Fordism, we would have another one like this. And if you look at my book, I have a whole series of epochal shifts. You know, like Marx would have gone through the various stages of socioeconomic epochal eras and how they tie in with epochal styles. But what I'm expecting, of course, then we can already, somebody could sit down and already chart the various subsidiary styles within parametricism. And like modernism had, you know, the white modernism, the more functionalist, organic functionalism, the rationalism, then it moved into brutalism, high-tech, and so these are subsidiary styles. But modernism is, that is already going on, will go on, and maybe to much more potent and proliferous way. And this is also helpful, but the category of subsidiary style is not as important. So with respect to parametrism, that means the epochal style, I have no idea, nobody could predict what comes next and how long this will take, but I know in terms of what we can dream up as a kind of subtly, kinetically augmented and fluid and speaking environment, we can work on this for decades. I mean, certainly my life is too short to exhaust that.
So we had a question.
Kind of you asked already the question, but I'm going to expand a bit on it. So first of all,
speak up.
Okay.
Be confident.
Okay. So Helen kind of asked the question already. First of all, thank you all guys for sharing your projects. It's been inspirational seeing each of you pushing whatever you guys are doing. So I kind of appreciated that Helen actually asked that question. Like Mark Postergage actually put some strong counterpoints. And my question to all of you, and I know Theo's answer already, so that's good, I guess, is wouldn't we all benefit actually from an open dialogue and actually multiple voices expressing different points of view, like a brewing of ideas that actually will enrich both your discourse, but also the discourse of others. Like, I actually wish there was more than Mark Postergage. There may be some other people with different views, because if I would take it to what I understand myself as a millennial, I understand forums, I understand communities, I understand exposure, and being able to browse through all of that to kind of form my own, which sometimes is actually a collage of bits and pieces. So that's kind of my question. Wouldn't you agree that somehow the open dialogue, which Theo, I know somehow encourages, wouldn't we all benefit from that?
If I can speak, not with any agenda of parametricism, but just in terms of speaking very honestly, I think having a dialogue means that you actually have to have some respect. And I think to do that means that you can not necessarily be the one to appoint or to somehow talk about the death of something. Like, so for example, Mark has sat in our juries and has been part of our conversations, and I share, I think, the diversity in dialogue, because I think in a certain way it starts to actually clarify what is really the real motivation and agenda behind it. And I think if I had a problem with Mark's counterpoint is that I'm sure that there's a lot of criticism of parametricism, just like anybody who stakes a position on something. And honestly, I could see value on individual levels of colleagues, let's say at SciArc and other places, that may find some resonance with different kinds of philosophical inquiry. And I think that that's all fair. I think what is problematic is the fact that dialogue and discussion needs to find a platform and a forum. So everybody kind of screaming, saying what they're claiming to be, if that's called kit bashing, if that's called anything. I find that if it's useful for them personally, I think it's good, but I think they also have a certain accountability to make that accessible, to kind of open up that conversation in a more kind of critical way. So maybe that was my slight problem, if I'm really honest. He took a swipe at me, basically thinking that everything that I'm talking about has to do with some kind of old, outdated model of network theory and stuff like that. Actually, I find a lot more synergy with second-order cybernetics, some of his interests, but maybe that's not even on the table for conversation. I mean, Sajay talked about Lionel March, Rob was talking about different kinds of researchers. We have all kinds of interests that I think then get sent, have an opportunity to actually have a discussion and to enrich the conversation. What I think between all of them, if I'm really honest, they're all still design-oriented.
But I think Mark Berry and John Fraser come from a very different standpoint. In fact, the issue really does take in quite a wide spectrum of contributors, and also Mario Carpo as well, who has a kind of a different view. So I think it's much broader than you first expect. Yeah.
Myself, being an engineer and having more of a work that spans more about territorial aspects, working in landscape urbanism, at the end of the day, at the beginning I was surprised I was in the issue, but then I realized that it was also super interesting, the fact that I could actually come in, defend certain aspects of a formal project I've always been quite interested about, even though, as I said, I'm not necessarily working at the scales at which many others are doing. My preoccupation within even the work that I do with Enriqueta is more linked to natural processes, such as that small sort of like intervention. So in a way, I wasn't necessarily from the core of designers you would expect to be, and I was pleasantly surprised that I could actually express my interests within the field and talk about parameters and actually bring the question to my field of research that wasn't necessarily, I would say, what you would call the funny friend. So
to have urbanism in there, to have industrial design in there, and just to pick you up on the phrase, the formal project, I don't want this to be now sticking. Let's call it the architectural project, and then elaborate that the formal project is a necessary subsidiary stratum within that, but certainly not the end game. And that's always the danger with throwing out slogans, but we need them. And I think with respect to Mark, once more, I mean, I was talking on the edge of rudeness about this, but I mean, look, dialogue is great, but there needs to be a certain minimum amount of care and engagement, and not a kind of glib straw target bashing. And that's what I feel this is, and I think I was very disappointed and wouldn't have expected that, and maybe didn't have time, or he felt it's meant to be particularly provocative, but yeah, sometimes provocation is good, but it needs to be, it can't be that glib and flippant.
I think in one thing, like, yeah, if there isn't respect, like what does, it just becomes like trolling as opposed to any kind of, I mean, in millennium lingo, right? I mean, there needs to be some amount of management of like the forum, like so fully. I think it is in fully open discourse, like to be questioned, and also to therefore force new directions of inquiry. And like, if I weren't provoked, like I wouldn't be even remotely looking at Lionel March or other. But within that, I think like there should be some respect, and otherwise it just becomes like too diverse, and even in a kind of evolutionary way, like too much diversity of genes are like, you don't advance, you just get random mutations of like stuff, right? So
I think, I mean, from my perspective, I've been like for years in conversations in creeds, and I've been criticized as well. So I think a designer somehow puts together a model, a way through which you look at space and how it should evolve your own repertoire. So, I mean, all models are wrong by essence, but some are beautiful, some are useful. So it's very easy to enter in the repertoire of another person and destroy it. It's really easy. You can always do it. But I think the challenge of a creed, it's always to enter in this model and make a contribution that actually makes it richer, even if you're criticizing. So, and I think that's the beauty of our discipline. The moment you don't take this attitude, so I could go even to a retro and try to have an elegant creed. Because the moment you criticize it in a quite destructive manner, you are killing the discipline itself. You are just killing it.
I think you've hit on something there. It's also, the more successful you get in architecture, the more likely you are to get basically criticised, and that's a fact.
Yeah, but I think like also, I mean, I sat in this room 5 years ago when Patrik launched Parametricism Volume 1, 2, and the characters that were speaking were very different. Wolf Prix and Zaha and Eric Owen Moss and Zaropolo. And I think the conversation, I was asked to speak at that time, and Thomas Witzek, and I think our conversation at that point was trying to make sense of what Patrik was trying to say. And I could say that some of it resonated and other things didn't. And its power was at least it held something accountable and allowed, I think, a way to catalyze a conversation that, to be honest, was quite dormant for a while. Now, if I see the value in 2.0, I don't know if it's like a software, but is the inclusion, I think, of other things that wouldn't have been part of that conversation 5 years ago, which makes me feel that the discourse also in Patrik's world is evolving, and I think is becoming more inclusive, I think, to a generation that needs a platform. And that doesn't mean if Patrik likes you or he doesn't like you. It means that if there is value in seeing a community of people that are very design-oriented, in a time actually when design is not necessarily being privileged in architecture at all.
And it's when architects are actually denying design.
Right, which at the end of, it is a culture around that, and I think that it's obviously propagated by a lot of people, but at the same time I think it's a very known space with arguments that were actually very clearly articulated by a generation that wasn't mine, but with a little bit of history, you know it. And so I think that there is a certain nowness and a kind of necessity for young architects to see how they situate themselves within contemporary practice, if that means following normative practice or if that is instilling kind of new values of what architecture should be. And I think that the more that it's kind of opening up a framework to allow for that diversity to be kind of creating that conversational platform, then I think the more then it will actually open up and have more influence. Because I can tell you right now, I think design really matters. And sometimes it's difficult to actually be sitting in a conversation when you know that there are a lot of people that believe other. For me, it's very easy. Don't be an architect. Don't study here. If you're not someone that wants to very actively sort of engage in the world of ideas, in the world of technology, in a cultural and political context, you know, through architecture, then there may be other mediums to be able to work in that project. But I think design really He's at the heart of a lot of the conversations here. I was very pleasantly pleased, to be honest, to see Sajay and to Rob in particular, students of ours, actually give, I think, some amazing conversations, but it's not a DRL thing, and I was very happy to meet these guys in this kind of forum, where Eduardo, I see him every other week, but usually in graduate management committee meetings, which has nothing to do with the education of an architect or the practice of architecture, and urbanism. So for me, I think that's where the value is really important. So,
you know, just to come back, I mean, one has to see that the overall project of enhancing the built environment in line with the, let's say, demands and opportunities of civilization is, of course, a very broad project, which has many intelligence, all the engineering disciplines, but also within the disciplines, so many different contributors, which I reference and treasure, and see them making important contributions, partial, and yet also there's elements where there are limits and need to be criticized, move forward. So, you know, Charles Jenks I mentioned, OMA and REM can be mentioned, many others, Bill Hillier, the science and architecture approach, and how much this has contributed and how much it, as yet, we have to go beyond this too, Colin Rowe and the Phenomenology Project. So there's a lot of things are synthesized in my books and also here in this magazine. I mean, I have Manuel de Landa brought in because there's somebody who's been with the discipline for a long time, and as a philosopher and expert of Deleuze, and now more and more social philosophy project, and some of his writings which speak to the sensibility and social theory which underpins my work. I've invited him and coached him, and we had communicated about doing something which also ties in, brings the built environment in, and it's a wonderful article I can highly recommend. But also somebody like John Fraser, who, yes, was for a long time very skeptical about, because he's somebody who's hearing this and that and not looking closely. And that's what I realized. There's so much prejudice, so much quick rejection. But with somebody like John, who has been an amazing giant of our field and expanding and pioneer of computation in architecture, and I remembered as a young student his studios here in computation without computer, that in the end he's totally committed to the project and are brought in, should be a signal that I'm certainly willing and wanting to have that as a very, very broad coalition. And a criticism is also to overcome self-limitation, and that we kind of hit it off so well with John was important, but it is, I realize more and more, it is a one-to-one engagement, respect and trust, and clearing out all the prejudice bit by bit, and that's what I'm realizing, that I realize I have to do and be prepared to do it, but so I'm very happy with the characters. A lot of them were skeptical, and maybe Mark Burry is the same. It's a very similar case, where he would initially maybe disturbed and misunderstanding what we're about, and that coalition building is very, very important. And I'm not writing Mark off altogether, but it needs to be, as you said, there needs to be certain structure and form and culture of engagement. And if you're very friendly, then one pushes a little bit further, but I don't think it's misunderstood. The way I'm kind of could be challenging sometimes. Ultimately, it's never ad hominem. It's always with a purpose. And I think this, and I'm very grateful to you and AD. It's such a prize to put one of these things together, and I hope it is doing well and will dent the history of architecture a little bit.
There's probably other questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here. I have two questions. Let's first imagine the far future, a city of 5 million people, and the whole city is parametric. And then you have an individual that lives in this parametric city, but wants to wants to make his personal living environment something that is totally anti-parametric in a way, and he wants to live in a kind of a cubicle and maybe let's say that or something totally different, and the environment always adapts parametrically to everything people want, but he doesn't want that. He wants the contrast. He wants the interruption. Is he wrong? What would the social system in a parametric society be? What kind of democracy would it have? Could parametricism and society that has a parametricism entirely could...
So you're asking whether you have the freedom to live in a shed if you want in a parametric society. Is that it?
No, like in something very sophisticated.
I had the question quite a few times. That's a very common question, and I've been confronted with this a few times. Before I get to the political element, I mean, I would say that, first of all, the built environment is now professionalized. Professional designers, which deliver that. So if you have if you're a client, you want to have a certain new space for yourself to host an institution, an enterprise, you would go to an architect, right? And my vision is, the assumption is that these architects should ideally be all trained up and socialized into the global best practice paradigm with these kind of methodologies, sensibilities I'm talking about. And if there's a fully a kind of evolved and continuously evolving, let's call it parametric cities, as you call it, which by the way will also have historical layers within it, but worked through and integrated into an overall evolving texture. You imagining something kind of alien-like, let's say, a Chipperfield-style intervention, or even a Quinlan-Telly intervention as this, you wouldn't necessarily want that because it would attract an inordinate amount of attention to itself, as suddenly this kind of thing, like a piece of a plastic bag thrown into nature. It's basically like throwing garbage at nature. That would be that intervention which would just be willfully disruptive. That's like pollution in an order. You know, why would you want to even do that? And wouldn't the discipline kind of filter that out? It doesn't make sense. And maybe so that why would you even want that?
Well, let's say that everything is.
I don't know. I live in a Victorian terrace, and it sometimes sucks because I have to go up the stairs with the trolley of the baby and everything, so it's a bit of a nightmare, right? But I cannot say to the people that design those terraces, don't design them, right? You may end up having somebody that cannot just bring out the little trolley because you are building stairs. Like, they did something, it made sense, it could be criticized, but you cannot just write it off. And says you should, or it's wrong to think like that because somebody in the future may actually be not comfortable with the house. So I mean, yeah, I think as a discourse, it can be criticized as such, but if you take it to the extremes, it will always sound funny. But I mean, I don't have a lift.
Where architecture is so, rolled out to that extent, you're only ever going to, as you say, design an institution or a flagship building. There's only going to be money for that, or a section of the city. You're never going to get into that sort of situation.
Well, I mean, no, it's just a question of time. Let's say 50 years in, and let's say we were already in the hegemony of parametricism. We could be, let's say, the first 10 years delivered it, like the 1920s for modernism, and then we kind of starting to conquer the field, and every client, every intervention would be hiring a parametricism, and now you have in London going up 200 towers and another 500 projects. 30, 40 years on, this would be a different place, a different city. So that's the scenario, right? A fully parametricism city, and of course these are individual. It's not a master plan. In my scenario, if you read the article, this complex variegated order and emergent identity and local identities would emerge through past-dependent, cumulative identity building and differentiation bifurcation, so that we wouldn't have what we have now, the kind of sameless, identityless build everywhere, but we have these identities growing and emerging, and but of course it would depend on this rigor and respect and professional self-respect of participating in something which is valued in the field for very good reasons, theoretically reflected, and therefore, yes, you can be a contrarian. You can dismiss the rules, and you can stand up now and pee into the corner instead of going to the toilet. But why would you want to do that? Why would you want to make yourself impossible? So that's the way to see it, and it's not going to be centrally imposed. Certainly not by me. I'm just somebody entering a discourse and making suggestions, but it will be a bottom-up, self-regulating discourse practice, which of course evolves, and the doctor today is not using a sledgehammer to anesthetize somebody. Then he would make himself impossible and should be expelled from the field. Now, we are not in that stage. That's why I'm saying we're in a very primitive stage, where we're in a kind of stage of chaos, where we don't have even on the most basic level, a set of shared values you can rely on. That's why this is a sort of disconcerting but I think that is unnatural condition, and that I think field should emerge, and it had in 1960 established a kind of, let's say, hegemony of modernist sensibilities, methodologies, ethos, and where you were socialized into something you could rely on. Of course, in 1980, a lot of that was disrupted and out of the window, because civilization, which modernism was adapted to, had radically transformed, and the discipline had to rethink its position, and it was initially just a brainstorming and anything goes, to coming up with something, back to historic city, all sorts of things, and there was a reconvergence, and we're building the discipline once more, now adapted to the new kind of condition. But we're still not there, and I'm getting frustrated with this. That's why I'm ramping up the kind of polemic, if you like, and particularly also because the last 6 years have been a bit of a backtracking and waste, with I suspect. But it's highly unnatural that we have this kind of, let's say, immature, incongruent field which doesn't even agree on fundamental values.
Could I just?
But if we had that, I think the Parametricism city would self edit. And why would you want to pee into this corner here?
I mean, I would just say, no, please. No, please, I'm a gentleman.
Okay, I just want to add to the thing is like, I mean, when you are calling the city, I mean, city is the platform that sustains the history of urbanism and architecture. So you are always, and what is fascinating about it is like it really can take all the discourses and you can see it as you walk on the city. So there is nothing, so when you visit a city and you have read the history of the city, you enjoy it 10 times better, like infinite times more than if you don't know it. So what is true that maybe it's lacking is that in each time of the history there is a vision about how to embrace the challenges that the society has. And you can see like and then there is a criticism. So it's like, it's a cultural loop and that is really rich. So when there was the problem of the sanitation, Serta came with his model. The model worked and then it was criticized. Just like trying to ask the question of the parametric city is a bit denying what the city is. Other thing is that you ask the question, what is your vision as parametric urbanism, as a way of acting into the city? And I think this is necessary, and it has always been in the history of urbanism. We have a series of problems, we have a specific social context, And I have a vision, because architects, we provide vision. We don't provide solutions, technical solutions. Our engineers, who are 10 times better, we provide a vision. And this vision is supposed to be criticized and to say, I don't want it. But that's the value of the vision. So it's about urbanism and not the city. The city is the platform that can take us all in a conversation, I will argue.
Can I just follow up to what you're saying? I think there are 2 points, right? One is, if a parametric city is fixed and finite, dynamism, like, I think one of the things is that maybe I feel like your question somehow is preempting that there would be one response. Let's say, for example, from my perspective, if parametricism has features that are adaptive, if we talk about evolution as something that's co-evolved with us, if we talk about models of participation, if we talk about expression being individualized and actually amplified and having an influence, then I think, let's say, the reservations of this idea of a control or a right or a wrong do get weeded out, but they don't get weeded out because of a lack of expression. It's actually by amplifying a certain locality that has a meaningful influence. I think the difference is not an issue about if it's a formal shed versus a curvilinear form. I mean, we could debate that kind of conversation, and I think we would have different questions. But I think fundamentally, if these things are going to co-evolve, if we're looking at machine learning, if artificial intelligence is shaping some of our computational strategies, then this is not just going to happen in a vacuum. This is going to happen through our critical engagement with it. And then I think a lot of the sometimes knee-jerk responses to things is the same way with technologies. I don't know if you sat in my chat, but once those technologies are out there, some people get afraid of them, right? And sometimes people want to put them back in the box, literally. But it doesn't work like that. So I think what is really important is to try to find models and try to upgrade the conversation that allows and makes affordances for those things to actually amplify further. But I think the conversation is really like, if this is an ecology of things, then it really has to participate. It has to recognize these other things. It has to correlate. It has to kind of have a meaningful co-evolution. And I think if design is an important factor, which I would like to hope that everybody believes in that is going to be multifaceted. But how it somehow is resolved is something that should be correlated. It's in that moment of correlation where I think those new values are going to happen. I think we have to accept that there is latency and uncertainty, and that the time-based aspect of architecture and urbanism is really the beautiful aspect. Like, that's where poetry lies, you know, and all of this, is how this thing is really evolving over time. That's why we haven't realized finite master plans in the history of our civilization. They've always evolved in a certain way, and in a very adaptive way. The city is an interesting model, but it shouldn't be limited, I think, from one scale of resolution. I think it needs to work its way through all of these different things. And that's what I find important to the kind of computational practice. That's what I find important to some of the questions about having a discussion. It's like those values are not inherent in something. Those values are born in the space in between, sometimes a lot of disagreements.
Also the scope in which something can be realised. Going back to modernism, it was about, yes, the perceived failure of the style, a disenchantment with the style, but it was actually also about economic and political integration. It was about the fact that, post-war there was a huge push for housing, and that stopped by the 70s, the 80s. You've got Reagan, Thatcher, neoliberalism. Basically, the plug was pulled on that kind of push to build. But the only place that can happen really now is China. And the Chinese government have announced in February that they want 50% of the environment prefabricated. And it's only somewhere like that could possibly happen on a large scale.
But I think regardless, the questions that underlie architecture and urbanism remain. The housing issue remains today. And so I think what is important for the next generation of architects is to feel how they can participate with the ever-evolving challenges and restrictions.
But they have to work in a totally different way.
Exactly.
I just want to come back maybe because there was a political question in your comment, and my take has always been and remains, but albeit with a new emphasis. First of all, to say that Parametricism ties in with the post-fordist network society as a civilizatory venture which is technology-driven and has a series of cultural implications and ways of life implications, and that is what Parametricism as built environment contribution ties in with, irrespective to some extent of the different political frameworks and structures this civilization chooses to enhance post-fordism further. But of course, these political structures are an independent subsystems, to some extent co-evolving subsystem, and we are not in charge of this, so we shouldn't become politicians and amateur politicians, but you need to observe that. However, stepping back, I think that, for instance, the transformation from a social technocratic, more centralized and planned and socialist set of political regimes evolving into more kind of neoliberal conceptions, where some of that state was rolled back, meant something. We have to observe that, and I'm extrapolating from that. So when I want to think about the political frameworks I'm tying the Parametricism project to, I'm certainly not going to, it will be maybe an improbable hypothesis to think that we're moving back into kind of a state-planned condition. I rather expect liberalization to move forward and then ask the question, if urbanism of the previous era was premised on a strong state and planned and positive planning and infrastructure building and establishing orders on the scale of a Brasilia, for instance, what does it mean for the prospects of a dynamic urban order beyond what we're now seeing as the result of neoliberalism, with this kind of disarticulated urban spill condition? So but it happened to be also the case that in the meantime I got politicized by 2008, and my political sensibilities have moved into the direction of more of a libertarian outlook and actually wanting and seeing more free market conditions as a way forward. And again, there's a congeniality I see between Parametricism and that project, but as a professional architect, I'm not banking on this. I don't want to hinge what I'm certain is to be the solution in built environment terms for the civilization, conditional on the politics. But if I'm engaging in the political debate, and if this goes this way, I already know that Parametricism would flourish, and there's a strong congeniality with respect to the kind of urban formation bottom-up as a discursive practice, rather than top-down through bureaucracy, it can still deliver an urban order. And let's say the Liberland project, which is at the moment, of course, more of a concept and inspiring platform with a potential reality, is an interesting one to speculate, where one would have, I feel, the chance to the right political conditions for full flourishing of what I conceive to be the parametric city in your terms. But again, I'm careful to insist on, let's say, professional independence of these domains, although they're co-evolving. I hope that answers your question.
My question is about agent-based semiology. From what I know and have seen, it's more of a syntaxing method of what you have already made, or the iterations that you made, and you syntax them and you find out. Could it be used as a way of generative method in designing the interactions between the simulated people could morph around the spatial need, their spatial needs, minimum spatial needs?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. I think that there's potential to using crowd in a generative space spawning condition. but this is premised. But it is at the same time. It's very tenuous, because those crowds are never outside space, and so you can't get a starting point. It's always already a doubly contingent condition you start with, so you have to start somewhere in the middle, and then evolve the space through the formation. But you can't start without having some kind of a priori of a spatial condition. And you think about it, even a flat surface versus a stepped or sloped one is already an a priori. So there's methodological dilemmas, although you have the right instinct, and when it comes to responsive environment layers within that, we're getting into an active shaping and reshaping. But of course, these things are already always configured. So we can only talk about being in the middle somewhere and in a reconfiguration game. So you never get out of the need to have an initial positing of a spatial constitution of. The same with biological evolution. You always do the next step with a kind of claptrap apparatus you already lumbered with to do the next thing with. So that's something which is. But yes, I mean, it's been on my mind, and I've thought about it a little bit. That aspect of generativeness with respect to that methodology, and it's not a straightforward answer, as you can see.
There's a question. Do you want to get in?
We've seen many of these crowd pictures and crowd simulations and this kind of things, which are very momentaneously based, like the robots that you showed, basically. But every interaction in space also leaves ties when we leave it. So the space that we are creating affords the social structure of our society and forms the ties of our social network. Yeah. How do you have any ways or any trials how you incorporated that in your agent-based modeling?
Yes, of course. I mean, that would have to be. I mean, that's lacking in the current crowd modeling tools are basically circulatory crowds where you usually assume an anonymous mass. So there's no structure, no social structure implied, no valencies of friendships, although they're getting there. They're looking now also at the group, what if a family moves? And it's not just individual atoms. What I'm talking about is actually, and you see it already happening in places like the Bureau Hubble Smart Space team, which I'm collaborating with and starting to collaborate with. They're itching to move beyond, well, certainly beyond evacuation into everyday circulation, and I want to generalize. They have now situations that's in hospitals where people move into a foyer or a kind of homeostasis, coming and going in a waiting room. Still very, very simple, where usually people are not, they're individuals. And what you're talking about, we need to build a social structure into this. People are not just indifferent individuals. They come with biases, with closer and lesser ties. And yes, there certainly would be within the scope and would be a necessary element of an upgrading of engineering crowds to what I call architectural crowds. I call them semilogically charged crowds, frame-dependent crowds. Yes, absolutely. And this would come through the client. So the client would, instead of giving us a schedule of accommodation, which is already mediated through an architect translating some kind of, I don't know how they translate this, into an account of the players, employees, visitors, the various staff categories, and their kind of valencies that could be done empirically through who is talking to who knows who has to talk to who, what kind of patterns and valencies should be embedded. And yes, and there will be complementary roles, teacher, staff, undergraduate, graduate, all these things would matter and would be just a brief, because there's an organization, institution, some of it well-established, some of it speculative, and that becomes the brief. As you build up the crowd as a differentiated crowd with these network valencies. And I mean, there's a whole paradigm of network analysis where this is happening. It's the social science paradigm that all intelligence will flow into the field. Now that's a huge thing. I've mapped it out, and I've also at the same time elaborated. This stuff is not just physical stuff. It's all phenomenologically and subjectively reading dependent. You read the space in one way or another, and it is also a text. And so, but what I find stimulating, so I call this generalized life process modeling, where it's literally also a situation like here, where we're relatively stable, and there's a bit of coming and going, and how you fill this room, who's coming to the front, who's coming to the back. It's every situation, everything, every built environment. And you're absolutely right. So I invite you to join me to my next seminar and join my research.
Can parametricism be the learning machine of society then, according to the studies being developed? Do you see a future that parametricism can predict behavior, change behavior, influence society in a more general terms through like design?
Yeah, well, it's the built environment which has been designed and evolves and keeps evolving according to these principles. Would be structuring, and yeah, you socialized into it. It's a hugely information-rich text. I mean, you wouldn't, you know, it disburdens your memory, because the things you should remember to do and how to behave is kind of in a conditioned way laid out. It's a bit like Herbert Simon saying the complexity of the ant's path is in the environment and not in the ant itself only. So that's very important, that there's these externalized memory structures which we rely on, for instance, and and then it becomes also augmented with intelligence and AA augmented intelligence, and populated by robots as well as humans. I think yes, and we also talked about the environment itself becomes a learning environment if it's responsive. It and has feedback mechanism, you know, dwell time feedback, so that the light level should be increased and decreased. In this situation, there could be a learning intelligent environment, which evolves and learns to be a more pleasurable and then productive and a host. These are all potentials one could also now simulate in the models. We just have to agree, and I'm going to shake hands with you, that we need to bring that into the model, if it is meant to be an architectural model. And but what you have the right intuitions, absolutely. And all these guys are already into machine learning, and also this idea of a machine vision. It's fascinating that you have to make these kind of demarcations and boundaries and make them conspicuous, and worry about that the camera can't decompose a very, very complex scene. It's the same with reading letters and sound, voice recognition. You know, when you're in a computer, you always have to kind of, we are still better at this. We have to read a kind of funny, distorted text. But we're not infinitely good at this. So what they reflect with respect to machine vision to make the robot inhabit an environment, I'm saying the phenomenological project is reflecting our cognitive capacity and perceptual capacities. And it's equally fascinating what we actually register. You can also diagram that. And that needs to be folded into the design. So we're not, as you're prepared to design for a robot with a phenomenological project you're not explicit to, and I'm saying you have to do that for us. But it's all it's all laid out. It's hard to work on it, and I've been working on a number of studios. But the axiomatic and theoretical positing of all this is in my books anyway.
But with regards to the system you were describing of trying to embed these agents with sort of like the capacity to assess the environment and assess all those values. I mean, at least when I look at these images, I think while I still see I still see that it's extremely intelligent or interesting what you were saying about the environment that learn, that change the light. I mean, I just find that fascinating. But the minute you have to introduce somehow in the code of that little person that he will feel in a certain way or another way when he sees a certain texture, aren't you at the end of the day falling into the same position that you were actually grilling Sajay before when he was trying to say, yeah, that's what I like somehow, or that's my preference? Aren't you kind of like trying to, at the end of the day, you are introducing in that little sort of like a agent the same values that you do when you design in a different way somehow, because he's going to recognize it and respond somehow. So how is it making the entire process better? The fact that you are kind of like, I don't know, perhaps there is a certain
I get a handle.
diffusion of that.
For the first time, I get a handle on this and simulate a life process versus with a set of assumptions I can also involve, and I keep looking at this, keep running it and rerunning it, and then I can give that that environment more subtlety and of distinctions. Instead of 3 steps, I'm putting a gradient on. But of course, that agent you can put onto that gradient. Now the behavior is not snapping, but it's kind of modulating from one to the one. It's trivial. Of course, you have to reflect whether the agent is actually perceiving those differences. So you have the phenomenological loop, but you don't have to give that capacity to that agent in your model. You have another verification or plausibility check. But I think it's not. You build up that complexity, and you do it comparatively, with a simpler layout, with a simpler set of agent, that meaning within an relative information poor environment versus those in a more information rich environment, and then you run them and see where do you get a quicker hit of relevant encounters. And you can measure this, right? You can draw all the relevant measures off the model. You can chart it, and so I think it's viable. It's a viable project. Does it require a lot of painstaking elaboration to make it plausible, to make it scientific? Is there a lot of coding effort to be brought into it and questions to be raised? Of course, it hasn't hardly started. What I've done so far in a few years is illustrative student projects that all they do is illustrate and as if a potential, and you can see that this could make sense and could be compelling, convincing. And I feel it is an absolute compelling once somebody's established this as a way of as a service. Of course, for a sufficiently complex and large problem, not for a single family dwelling or for something with 3 rooms and 5 people, you might not need it. But we're talking about 1,000 rooms and 5,000 people on a campus. There's all sorts of categories. I'm thinking of Google Campus. Then you can see that once you've established that and can build it up, that it's absolutely compelling, and you clean the market, because I want to make that a marketable service. I don't know if it's going to be there in 3 years or 5 years with the research program I'm doing. And that's, in the end, it's actionable theory. And in the end, theory is all for that. And that feeds back into a healthy theoretical enterprise and doesn't become kind of algebra of obfuscating terms like OOO and others who have no project, and you're just spinning algebras without purpose. We need to distinguish that. That can't be put on one plane. Oh, this is out and that is in. I mean, we are miles apart in terms of sophistication, but it's hard. And you can only discover this when you drill in. But I'm no longer shy. I'm just saying it, and and I'm happy to sit with anybody to slag it out one to one. But yeah.
The only thing I would say, Patrik, I mean, I think the crowd simulation work works at certain scales where, like, let's say if I find certain sensitivity differences, let's say in my own work and things that you're interested in. For large scale, for Google, you have to generalize certain kind of human behaviors, have some kind of actor, scene kind of strategies. For me, on the other hand, though, it has to go beyond simulation, because a lot of our work, if it's in Trafalgar Square or if it's in the Barbican, it's trying to use installation as a prototype to learn from. So I think And I think the distinctions are meaningful because then I think it's not about one or the other. It's a certain sensitivity guided by giving things agency. And beyond, let's say, crowds, if you take one form of step back of abstraction, like let's say if Rob is talking about swarms of printing robots and drones, or if Sajay is talking about augmented kind of robotic processes that have the capacity to deal with change. It's that agency in the things themselves. If they're human, they're non-human. It's that ecology, at least that I describe it anyway, of those interactions that I think are really important. And those affordances, some of them are prescriptive because there are certain habitual tendencies, but a lot of other ones should be about curiosity, about creating different levels of sensorial communication, focusing on things that are also beyond visual, where, for example, degrees of softness, pliancy,
Totally.
all of these
All
other
the senses
features.
are implicated,
Right.
gradients, vestibular sense, particularly if so much information to process, the simultaneous engagement of all senses. And I want to say, I mean, I feel the project I'm talking about is about 10 years away from a compelling best practice of, like space syntax. For me, space syntax is a model. It's not as encompassing, not as deep, let's say, but it's been compelling in terms of a research project which started with theory, theoretical insight and axiomatic, then built up a set of tools, built it up into a service provision, and now is ubiquitous in terms of a large-scale urban project, nearly necessity, and by the way, fully integrated in my theoretical edifice and also in the Bureau Hubble Smart Space Suite, etc. And I'm enhancing that. But for me, what I'm talking about is 10 years in. What Rob is talking about is most probably 50 years in. And not to qualify, this is both important, but I think Rob's model needs to have the crowds in it. Your models need to have the crowds in it. Your models need to have the crowds in it. That's what I'm insisting on. And so you can't avoid the crowds. Sure. You make your world is much more advanced. I will have much more static channeling and a little bit of, because you have that kind of self-assembly swarming of robots in a continuously evolving ecology, but without the crowds, it's just for me it remains some kind of well, let's just say a kind of screensaver, not quite really, but a three-dimensional screensaver. You know, you need to load this up with intentionality. Of course, not all at once, but you've done it already 3-4 times. The tools are the same. What's so wonderful about that the meaning of it all can be brought into the same platform with the same tools, with the same conceptions. It's one more subsystem which correlates with the others. And some of them are agent-based, some of these are parametric-driven. But it's the critical and crucial, the ultimate of subsystem which drive all the other, and we should finally look at this, because what's the point of you looking at these at these morphologies you've created, and then what? Then you're imagining these happenings, but how? Then you're falling at that crucial moment. You fall back.
No, I think you should have more faith in some of us. Because you
it's
made
not about faith. It's
no.
It's just the fact. It's a simple fact.
That the fact.
Factual.
Okay, I'm going to end on a good note. But you sort of, when you were showing the parking project of Zaha, the project of yourselves, you sort of said as a calling to a challenge, I would call it, to some of us younger generation, that you're going to default and do that other stuff. And what I'm saying to you is, for sure, fundamentally, if you understand what's being discussed here, we're for sure not going to do that. So have faith. And you may be surprised, and I actually feel like that's where the power.
It's a one-liner, right?
No, it's not a one-liner. It's like 15 years of banging.
What's the methodology of elaborating that intuitive final judgment call into something you can work on? And what I'm positing is that, look, we use drawings. Before you had a one-shot image of what you should build, most probably more or less exactly the same what you have been building. Then you can kind of sort out. This was before architecture appeared. It was just constructing. You break this line, you measure out this rectangle. So very, very primitive. It's a one-liner. drawing means that you start, you elaborate, you work on, look back, work on, try, and you in sometimes a project you build up drawings and aspects, a simulation of the artifact over 2 years, right? And then, but similarly, now I'm looking and saying, well, great, but what it's all for, you still just have the one-liner shot. Now I want to co-evolve that elaborate building up of the artifact with an elaboration of what this artifact is supposed to deliver. Not 5 labels, foyer, seminar room, but what it really is going to deliver, because we don't live in an era of stereotypes, so there's only 5 things. So we need to have the medium of elaborating the life process as it is shaped by the built environment process, and that's what you need to get, because otherwise we on that crucial level we haven't still started to elaborate. We have no methodology of building that up.
I think that project is quite a, I mean, I'm not doubting that you have it. It will need a quite high level of honesty in what is it that it can really solve and what are the problems that actually you can't really get in.
I don't have it. I have illustrations of it and have a vision of it.
But Patrik, I think your challenge is a good one. I think your challenge to the younger generation is a good one. And what I mean is...
It's an absolute compelling one.
I get, no, look, we're on the same...
And I would...
It's almost a consolidation of the kind of intelligence and knowledge that you'd get from a really experienced architect, you know, in terms of projecting space.
Yeah.
And it would be almost like developing that through computation and learning from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the black box of that tacit knowledge accumulated into... But can we really trust it?
Yeah.
Can he really intuit a kind of that level of complexity? He can't. And that means we are, you know, at the moment, relative to my vision, we are totally incompetent. We're not, because
that will help you to transmit to the client what you already know, what you see some special configuration, and he will be able to get it.
But this is beyond. There are things that are beyond client and. And I think
it's the right purpose. Let's say think of the client as ourselves, as a cooperative, wanting to create the space of our beautiful venture. We would be in the same position. I mean, client is something which sometimes is, we seem to wanting to alienate us from our clients. That's an infantile conception anyway. But anyway, substitute society. Maybe this democracy is hiring us to create its space of whatever, something which is fully benign in your terms. And then how would you deliver to this if it has a certain level of complexity and innovative, open-ended thrustness in terms of the morphologies is yet to emerge? How do you actually know what they mean? Nobody's seen them ever more, because it becomes ever more urgent, because degrees of complexity, every project has now new unheard of level of complexities potentially, and novelty, unseen and unheard of novelty. Now, how do you imagine what that means? You can't just imagine it, staring at it.
No, but I don't think anybody's arguing that. I think
No, that's
I'm
what
not.
You're doing. You're just staring at this.
I'm not
You're
staring.
staring at your forms. Mute. You're staring mute at your forms.
That's what I mean, Patrik. You gotta have more faith in us, buddy.
It's just fact.
It's not fact. It's not fact. You know, I
That's
think,
where it ends.
No, because if that's where it ends, then Mark is probably right. And that's my point. My point is that, not probably right from whatever he wrote, but if...
No, that's where you end your project. It's a matter of fact. Let's look at all the projects.
Yeah, we can look at all the projects. We could look at the infrastructures behind the projects.
Yeah, but
if it is an uncompromising kind of process of working through problems, I don't think it's a fair assessment to say like it's yet to come. You're saying it should be here now.
No. We should start working on it.
I'm accepting that, and I'm totally
so
for
from
it.
now on, that's the pact.
The pact is that I'm here at the table, right? Great. This is like the photo.
You already got what you wanted.
Patrik, I'm at the table. That's why I'm part of the conversation.
I think we need to go.
This is what
Thanks,
happens.
guys.
This is good.